Section 1. The Divide, the moment the world ended. There is a specific moment in the Fallout universe that everything else orbits around, the way debris circles a dead star. A single point in time so catastrophic, so total in its destruction, that 200 years later the world has not recovered, may never recover. A moment that the games keep returning to, keep circling back toward, as if even the stories themselves cannot stop looking at the wound. October 23rd, 2077. A Saturday morning. People woke up. They made coffee. They argued with their children over breakfast. They lay in bed a few minutes longer than they should have, listening to the radio, listening to the kind of music that makes you feel like the world is going to be okay. It was a Saturday. The kind of ordinary morning that people, in the safety of their routine lives, take absolutely for granted, the assumption, never consciously made but always present, that another morning will follow this one. Another afternoon, another Sunday. Then the sirens started. Most people who heard those air raid sirens assumed it was a drill. The Fallout universe had lived under nuclear tension for decades by that point. Air raid practice had become part of the social fabric, a ritual inconvenience, almost comforting in its familiarity. The government reminding everyone that it had thought about the worst. Plans existed. There was structure standing between ordinary life and catastrophe. The posters were everywhere, showing families calmly filing into shelters while a stylized atomic symbol gleamed in the upper corner. Preparation was presented as a form of patriotism. The drills had been run so many times that the sound of the siren had been drained of its urgency and replaced with something approaching routine. So, when the siren started up on that particular Saturday morning, the first reaction from most of the population was a practiced inconvenience. People set down their coffee cups, looked at each other with that familiar, resigned expression, started moving towards shelters, or didn't move at all, because last time it had been nothing. The time before that, nothing. Every single previous time, nothing. It was not nothing this time. The bombs began falling at approximately 9:47 Eastern Time, and the exchange that followed lasted for roughly 2 hours. 2 hours for the entire world to end. Less time than most feature films. Less time than a long Sunday lunch. In those 120 minutes, more destructive energy was released than in all of the previous human conflicts in recorded history combined. Every war, every battle, every siege and slaughter and artillery barrage that humanity had ever inflicted upon itself, and all of that accumulated violence added up to less than what fell in those 2 hours on a Saturday in October. By the time it was over, the sky was changed, the soil was changed, the air itself was changed, the water was changed. The world that had existed that morning with its diners and drive-in theaters, its propaganda posters and Nuka-Cola machines, its gleaming power-armored soldiers and sleek atomic automobiles, that world was simply gone. Not transformed gradually, the way civilizations usually fall, through slow rot and creeping decline and the patient erosion of time. Gone with the sudden finality of a light switched off. The question of who switched off that light first is one the games never definitively answer, and that ambiguity is one of the most quietly unsettling things about the lore. The official narrative from within the Fallout universe points toward China. President Dick Richardson of the Enclave, when confronted by the Chosen One in Fallout 2, claims that China launched first, that the Chinese government fired on America when all hope of winning the Sino-American War was finally lost. But Richardson is far from an objective source. He is a man sitting in a classified bunker, convinced he represents the legitimate government of a country that no longer exists, running genocidal experiments on surviving populations he has classified as genetically compromised non-citizens. His testimony is self-serving in ways that are very difficult to untangle from truth. What the lore actually suggests, pieced together from scattered terminal entries and holotapes and the evidence the games deposit for careful players, is considerably more disturbing than a simple narrative of one nation attacking another in desperation. In the years leading up to the Great War, the world had been slowly strangling itself on resource depletion. The alternate history of Fallout diverged from ours in the aftermath of the Second World War, specifically at the point of the Transistor Revolution. In our history, that revolution, the miniaturization of electronics following the transistor's invention in 1947, transformed technology entirely, leading eventually to microprocessors, personal computers, and the digital world we inhabit. In Fallout's history, that revolution did not happen. The vacuum tube remained the dominant electronic component, and technology stayed physically large and power-hungry. anchored to mid-century aesthetics even as it advanced in other directions. Atomic power arrived as the great solution to the energy problem, powering everything from enormous industrial facilities down to individual automobiles, producing the iconic aesthetic of the Fallout world. Chrome curves, pastel colors, the visual language of post-war American optimism applied to a world that never stopped believing in the nuclear age. But atomic power came too late, and the civilization it powered was still deeply dependent on fossil fuels, and those fuels were running out. By 2052, the resource crisis had become existential, and the United Nations dissolved under the combined pressure of member states pulling out as their economies began to fracture. With the UN gone, there was no framework left for managing the conflicts that came next. What followed was called the Resource Wars, and it drew in nearly every major power on Earth. The European Commonwealth went to war across the Middle East for control of remaining oil. China pushed into Alaska, seizing American oil infrastructure the United States had been protecting since 2059. The United States responded not with negotiation, but with the annexation of Canada, not offering partnership but simply absorbing a sovereign neighboring nation by military force because it needed Canadian resources and had the military capacity to take them. The world that existed in the final decades before the bombs was one where the old rules had already broken down, where the pretense of international cooperation had given way to naked resource extraction and military occupation. The propaganda machines kept running through all of it, kept printing their cheerful posters and broadcasting their optimistic radio programs, kept telling people that everything was under control, that American ingenuity and atomic know-how would find a way through. The Nuka-Cola Corporation was still launching new flavors. The government was still running air raid drills. The music on the radio was still bright and brassy and full of promise. Behind the cheerful facades, the governments and corporations of this world had already made their calculations. Some of those calculations involved making sure the war would happen. The Fallout television series introduced information that deepened this horror considerably. It depicted Vault-Tec executives in a pre-war boardroom explicitly discussing the option of instigating nuclear strikes as a strategic action, a way of clearing the geopolitical board and ensuring that only those they controlled would survive to rebuild. These were the same people who had built the vaults, who had sold families on the safety of those vaults, who had stood in living rooms and smiled and taken payments and assured parents that their children would be protected. In the same organization, at the same time, other conversations were happening about whether to trigger the apocalypse those vaults were supposedly built to survive. There is also the theory, suggested by scattered in-game evidence across multiple titles, that the final launch sequence may have been triggered not by deliberate decision, but by bad information, a scenario in which America's defense systems were fed falsified intelligence indicating an incoming Chinese first strike, causing automatic retaliatory protocols to activate in response to an attack that may never have actually been launched. A scenario in which the world ended not because of deliberate, calculated evil, though there was plenty of that operating at every level, but because of a failure in an information chain. Because systems designed to protect civilization executed their programming and instead destroyed it. If that reading is even partly correct, the Great War was not a choice. It was an accident enabled by the conditions that deliberate evil had already created, which is, in its own way, the most disturbing possibility of all. Not that someone chose this, but that the systems built to prevent it were the systems that caused it. For those who survived in the open in the moments after the initial strikes, the experience was unlike anything human memory had previously contained. The blast pressure from a nuclear detonation propagates outward at speeds that give essentially no time for warning or reaction. The thermal pulse, the flash of intense heat that precedes the physical shockwave, was capable of causing severe burns at distances of many miles for the largest warheads. Buildings within certain radii did not collapse. They were leveled, their structures swept aside by the same mechanical force that had turned the air itself into a weapon. Then came the fallout, the radioactive particles lofted into the atmosphere by the explosions, now drifting on wind currents, now settling back to Earth across thousands of square miles over days and weeks, contaminating everything they touched. Water became radioactive. Soil became radioactive. Food crops became radioactive. Animals that survived became mutated by exposure. And then the mutations passed through generations of reproduction until the organisms that had been animals became something new, something adapted to a world that had not previously existed. The wastelands the player explores in Fallout games 200 years after the bombs are what 2 centuries of that contamination looks like. The brown-orange sky where dust and particles thrown into the atmosphere by the bombs have never fully settled. The irradiated rivers running through cracked and baked soil. The buildings standing in states of peculiar selective preservation structures that absorbed direct blasts reduced to rubble, while buildings slightly outside the primary blast radii still stand with structural integrity, their windows blown out by shockwave effects but their walls still holding. The ruins of pre-war America in these games are not archaeological sites in the usual sense. Archaeology generally studies societies that declined over time. The ruins of Fallout's America are the product of sudden violent interruption. Offices where the paperwork is still on desks. Diners where the plates are still set. Supermarkets where shelves, long since stripped by scavengers, still bear original product signage. The world ended so abruptly that it left its entire material infrastructure standing a civilization frozen at the moment of its destruction. Every surface a document of the last ordinary morning. Walking through those ruins in any of the games carries a specific emotional quality that is difficult to precisely articulate. A child's shoe, alone in a crumbling bedroom, a birthday card, half-written, still sitting on a kitchen table, a terminal log that ends mid-sentence, cut off by whatever interrupted the person writing it, a refrigerator with a shopping list magneted to its door, listing items that someone expected to buy that Saturday and never did. These are not decorative details. They are the emotional argument the Fallout universe makes about itself, that what the Great War destroyed was not primarily infrastructure or political systems, but ordinariness. The ordinary life of ordinary people, the Saturday morning coffee, the birthday card, the shopping list, and the assumption that another ordinary day would follow. For those who made it into vaults in time, the experience of the bombs was mediated by steel and distance, the sirens, the rush, the chaos at vault entrances, crowds of people who had not bought spaces trying to get in anyway, security forces holding them back. Then the heavy blast doors sealing. The noise from outside cutting off, replaced by the hum of recycled air and fluorescent light. People looking at each other in that artificial light, understanding that the world they had known was gone, and that this sealed metal tube was all the world there was now. What most of them did not know yet, what most of them would never discover until it was far too late, was that the vaults had purposes that went beyond survival, that the people who had sold them their places behind those blast doors had planned something for them, that the doors sealing behind them were not only protecting them from radiation, they were also the doors of laboratories. But we will reach that in its own time. The broader dying that followed the initial bombs went on for months and years. For millions who survived the initial blasts and found food and shelter and thought they might have made it through, the following weeks brought a secondary wave of dying as radiation sickness progressed, and medical resources which had depended on the intact infrastructure of the pre-war world ceased to function. Crops failed where any had survived. Water supplies became unusable as contamination spread. Supply chains that had connected the continent, allowing the modern miracle of consistent food availability across vast distances, simply stopped. The death rate in the months following the Great War was extraordinary, not the sudden concentrated death of the initial strikes, but the slow, attritive death of a population that could no longer sustain itself with the resources available to it. 210 years later, in the Commonwealth of Fallout 4, the population of Greater Boston is a fraction of what it was on October 22, 2077. The political and economic and cultural complexity of a major American metropolitan area has been replaced by scattered settlements, raider camps, and the ruins of institutions that no longer have the population to support them. The people alive in the Commonwealth are the descendants of survivors, people who were either lucky enough to be in a vault or tough enough and fortunate enough to survive the surface, and whose children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren have inherited a world that has never known anything else. That inheritance, the specific psychological and cultural weight of being born into the ruins of a civilization whose existence you know about but cannot access, whose products surround you, but whose context you cannot reconstruct, is the emotional territory the Fallout games are actually exploring. The factions and the combat and the quests are the surface expression of something deeper, an extended meditation on what it means to live in the shadow of catastrophe that is permanent, that has become the only world anyone alive has ever known. War never changes. That is what the opening narration says, across multiple games. It is not a statement of despair, though it sounds like one. It is a statement about mechanism, about the underlying dynamics of resource competition and power accumulation that survived the Great War because they are features of human organization rather than features of any particular civilization. The New World runs on different fuel. The conflict patterns it produces are startlingly similar. And in all of it, in the scattered holotapes and crumbling terminals, and the occasional heartbreaking personal note, the ghost of October 23rd keeps surfacing. The Saturday morning, the coffee, the sirens that everyone thought were a drill. 2 hours. The whole world in 2 hours. If you are watching this from somewhere quiet and dark, drop a comment with where you are and what time it is. And if you have not subscribed yet, doing that means you will not miss whatever comes next. Section 2. Before the fire, the old world's secrets. Understanding Fallout means understanding the world that burned, not the world as it exists in the game's irradiated, fractured, populated by ghouls and mutants and feudal settlements, scratching existence from contaminated soil, but the world that existed before October 23rd, the one you only see in fragments. In holotape recordings with their pre-war voices, in terminal entries written by people who did not know they were writing the last entries they would ever write, in the cheerful swing music that still plays from old speakers in ruined buildings, its optimism rendered unbearable by context. That pre-war world is one of the most carefully constructed fictional settings in gaming, and the care is most visible in how deliberately incomplete the picture is. The games never give you a comprehensive view of what pre-war America was. They give you pieces, clues, a portrait assembled from evidence rather than from narration. The portrait that assembles, if you pay close attention across many hours and many games, is unsettling in very specific ways. The Fallout timeline diverged from ours somewhere in the mid-20th century, and the divergence was technological. In our history, the transistor was invented in 1947, and the revolution in miniaturization it initiated eventually produced the digital world we inhabit. In Fallout's alternate history, that revolution did not occur. The vacuum tube remained the dominant electronic component, and technology stayed physically large and aesthetically anchored to its era while advancing in the specific directions that the atomic age made possible. Atomic energy became the solution to every problem, powering homes and automobiles and factories, lighting cities with a clean, glowing promise of infinite possibility. The aesthetic this produces is extraordinary and iconic. The atomic age aesthetic of the 1950s, applied comprehensively and without irony to an entire civilization, lasting right up to the moment it destroyed itself. Chrome and curves, aquamarine and orange, smiling faces on cheerful posters. The visual language of post-war optimism applied to power armor and atomic bombs and government propaganda with equal enthusiasm. The world of Fallout before the bombs was a world that had never stopped believing in the promise of progress with a capital P, in the idea that science and industry and American ingenuity were on a trajectory of continuous improvement that would eventually produce an era of genuine abundance and security. The tragedy embedded in that aesthetic is that the world it describes was, underneath its gleaming surface, already failing in ways that the optimism was specifically designed to obscure. The American government of pre-war Fallout had, by the final decades, become something that called itself a democracy while hollowing that word of its practical meaning. The resource wars and the accompanying social pressures had created conditions in which the security apparatus expanded continuously, while civil liberties contracted correspondingly. Anti-communist sentiment had become something closer to a social pathology, a lens through which every form of dissent or difference could be reframed as potential subversion. The press remained nominally free, but the range of topics that could be covered freely grew narrower as the war continued. The military received an ever larger share of the budget. The gap between what the government said it was doing and what it was actually doing became, in the final years, a chasm. The Enclave operated within this chasm, and the Enclave is, in some ways, the secret history of the pre-war world, the thing that was always there, always operating, always making plans that the public presentation of American life was specifically designed to conceal. The corporations of pre-war America were almost uniformly complicit in this concealment and in the deeper architecture of what the Enclave was building. The boundary between government and private industry had effectively dissolved. Major corporations were not simply contractors to the government, they were participants in classified programs, recipients of intelligence, architects of systems that served both commercial and governmental purposes simultaneously. This fusion of corporate and governmental power is a structural feature of the Fallout world that the games document in their terminal entries and holotapes with remarkable specificity. Vault-Tec is the most visible example, and its story is the one the games return to most consistently. But Vault-Tec was embedded in a network of corporate relationships that makes understanding it in isolation incomplete. Robco Industries and its relationship with Vault-Tec is worth understanding clearly. Robco supplied the computing infrastructure, the terminals, the automated systems, the Pip-Boy devices that made the Vault program function at a technical level. The Pip-Boy, the iconic wrist-mounted personal computer that serves as the player's interface across multiple games, is a Robco product. The Vault's internal management systems, the automated overseers, the sealed record-keeping that preserved the evidence of the experiments, all of this ran on Robco architecture. The man who founded Robco was Robert House, who would survive the Great War and become Mr. House of New Vegas, and who had sufficient advanced knowledge of the war's timing that he spent years and enormous resources developing missile defense systems for Las Vegas. House knew what was coming. The question of precisely what he knew, and when he knew it, and what he chose to do with that knowledge and what he chose not to do, is one the games circle without fully resolving. West-Tech Research developed power armor under government contract, the T-45, the T-51, the eventual T-60 series that became standard military equipment in the final years before the war. Power armor is one of the pre-war world's most significant technological achievements. Fully articulated exoskeleton systems capable of extreme load-bearing, with integrated environmental systems and advanced protection against both conventional and nuclear threats. The Brotherhood of Steel's reverence for pre-war power armor is partially explained by how extraordinary it actually is. As a piece of engineering, there is nothing in the post-war world with remotely comparable specifications, but West-Tech was also the developer of the forced evolutionary virus under a government-funded defense research program aimed at creating physically enhanced super soldiers. The FEV research was conducted at Mariposa Military Base under conditions of extreme classification, using subjects who were not told what was being done to them. The program's goal was a human being resistant to radiation, disease, and physical trauma, the ideal soldier for the kind of prolonged, grinding conflict the resource wars had produced. What the research actually produced, when the FEV interacted with the environmental radiation that the Great War would release, was the super mutant enormous, physically powerful, and in many cases cognitively compromised to varying degrees. The mutants that threaten the wasteland in nearly every Fallout game are the legacy product of West-Tech's defense contract. Big Mountain Research and Development, the subject of the Old World Blues expansion for Fallout New Vegas, represents a third category of pre-war scientific enterprise, not directly military and not primarily commercial, but something in between, and stranger than either. Big MT was a think tank of extraordinary ambition, funded by government and corporate sources, operated by scientists of genuine brilliance, who had over time largely decoupled their intellectual activities from any sense of responsibility for their real-world applications. By the time the bombs fell, the scientists of Big MT had transplanted their own brains into mobile robotic platforms to achieve a form of immortality, conducted experiments in sonic weapons and dimensional physics and neuroscience, created biological weapons of extraordinary specificity. The facility was isolated enough to survive the Great War relatively intact, and its scientists continued their work afterward, largely unaware that the world they had been theorizing about had ended. Some of them are still working, 2 centuries later, preserved in their robotic bodies, still pursuing research programs whose original purposes have long since ceased to be relevant. 200 years of undirected research, still running, still producing results, with no one alive who remembers what any of it was supposed to be for. The pre-war world's social fabric, beneath the propaganda and the cheerful advertising, was under enormous strain in its final years. The new plague, a novel pathogen that emerged in 2053, killed hundreds of thousands and triggered national quarantine measures that the government managed by suppressing information about the disease's actual spread and severity. People were quarantined without being told why, their movements restricted, their communications monitored for signs of public unrest. The disease was eventually contained, but the measures used to contain it demonstrated how quickly the government was willing to abandon its stated commitment to transparency and individual rights, when security, or the appearance of security seemed to require. The annexation of Canada in 2076 is documented in the games with a specificity that implies it was not a clean or consensual process. There was resistance. There were protests and acts of civil disobedience by Canadians who did not wish to be absorbed. The resistance was suppressed. The Fallout games mention atrocities committed against Canadian civilians during the annexation in ways that are oblique but clear enough to establish the character of what happened. While American propaganda produced cheerful messaging about partnership and continental solidarity, the reality was military occupation of a neighboring nation whose resources America needed and whose consent America did not seek. Meanwhile, inside the United States, the social contract was under pressure from multiple directions. Workers in industries critical to the war effort faced increasingly authoritarian labor conditions. Protesters against the war were investigated. The government's public face remained optimistic and reassuring, while its classified operations expanded in scope and severity. The gap between the America that the propaganda depicted and the America that was actually operating became, in the final years, so large that it was essentially two different realities coexisting in the same physical space. The Nuka-Cola Corporation deserves its own moment here as a symbol of what that surface looked like in its most extreme form. Nuka-Cola was ubiquitous. The games are littered with its bottles and vending machines and branded merchandise. Nuka-Cola Quantum, one of the brand's premium variants, contained a mildly radioactive strontium isotope that made it glow blue. The company marketed this as a feature. The name of the isotope was in the ingredient list. The consumer literature described it as providing an energizing effect. Whether the corporation knew the specific health implications and sold it anyway, or whether the pre-war world's relationship to low-level radiation exposure was genuinely different from ours, given the pervasiveness of atomic technology, the games leave this ambiguous. But the image of a corporation marketing radioactive additives in a beverage as a premium selling point, and of consumers buying that beverage with enthusiasm, is a very precise satirical portrait of a particular kind of institutional relationship to truth. The other great institutional relationship the pre-war world normalized was with violence. The power armor walking the streets. The military bases integrated into civilian communities. The war that was always happening somewhere, always described as necessary, always justified by the same rotating set of threats that the propaganda machine kept refreshing. The Fallout universe's pre-war America had made war and its infrastructure so thoroughly normal that the people living inside it could not see it clearly. They could see the Nuka-Cola. They could see the Vault Boy smiling at them from every flat surface. They could see the promise of a future that was always being built just around the corner. They could not see that the facilities building that future were also running experiments on prisoners and planning for the day when the whole thing burned. The ruins are the argument, stated in physical terms that the landscape speaks for itself. This is what you built. This is what survived. This is what did not. There is a specific kind of grief available in the pre-war world of Fallout that has nothing to do with the bombs or the factions or the survival mechanics. It is the grief of recognizing something in the pre-war world's pathologies, its gap between stated values and actual practices, its normalization of institutional cruelty, its cheerful consumerism operating right alongside its darkest programs as familiar. Not alien. Not safely historical. Familiar. In the way that things you see every day eventually stop registering as remarkable. The genius of the Fallout universe is that it makes you feel the catastrophe not primarily as an event that happened to someone else in a fictional past, but as the conclusion of a process that you can recognize in progress. The bombs are the ending. The pre-war world is the story of how you arrive there, and the story is discomfortingly comprehensible. Section 3. The vaults. What they were really built for. If you ask most people in the Fallout universe what the vaults were for, they will tell you survival. Sealed underground habitats, designed and built by Vault Tech Corporation under government contract, intended to protect selected portions of the American population from the nuclear holocaust that the resource wars made increasingly inevitable. That is what the advertisement said. That is what the salespeople said when they went door to door through the neighborhoods of pre-war America, selling vault spaces to families who wanted the reassurance that if the worst happened, their children would be safe. The brochures were colorful. The Vault Boy smiled from every page. The pitch emphasized security, community, technology, all the things that a frightened family might want to believe in. Only 17 of the vaults were actually built to deliver on that promise. Out of the full network 122 vaults embedded across the continental United States, only 17 were designed and equipped as the functional, sustainable habitats they were marketed as. Those 17 were control vaults, in the experimental terminology. Their purpose was to give Vault-Tech's program a baseline population, a group experiencing relatively normal vault conditions against which the results of all the other experiments could be compared. In other words, even the vaults that worked correctly were tools. The families who lived good lives in functioning vaults were living as a control group. Everyone else was a variable. The true purpose of the Vault program, as the documentary evidence scattered across the games makes progressively clearer, was data collection at an unprecedented scale. Vault-Tech and its partners within the federal government and the defense industrial complex wanted information about human behavior under conditions of extreme stress, isolation, scarcity, manipulation, and manufactured crisis. They wanted to know what humans would do when resources ran out, when authority structures broke down, when communities were pushed past their social limits. They wanted to know how quickly moral frameworks collapsed under pressure, what forms of social organization proved durable and which disintegrated, how long a population could be manipulated before the manipulation became visible. They wanted to know these things because of a plan for after. The Enclave's influence over the Vault program connected the experiment network to a larger vision of the post-war world. Whoever emerged from the vaults with the best data and the most prepared population would be positioned to shape whatever civilization came next. The vaults were not shelters in any primary sense. They were preparation facilities, running programs in parallel, generating comparative data about how human groups perform under varied conditions of manufactured extremity. The people inside them were, in the frank language of the program's internal documentation, subjects. The specifics of what individual vaults were designed to test vary in their nature and their brutality. Vault 12, in the Bakersfield region of California, was built with a door that would not fully seal. This was intentional, an engineering specification, not a failure. The door was designed to remain slightly open, admitting gradual radiation contamination from the environment outside. The experiment was about the effects of sustained radiation exposure on an enclosed human population. The results, observable by the time of the original Fallout game, were the Necropolis Ghoul community people, transformed by 2 centuries of radiation exposure into something no longer quite human, some retaining intelligence and memory, others having lost the cognitive architecture that distinguished them from animals. They had been sold a sealed vault. They had been given a broken door by design, and they had not known, and by the time any external evidence might have reached them, it was decades too late. Vault 11, in the Mojave Wasteland, had an experiment built on sustained moral manipulation. The vault's residents were told, through a recorded message played upon arrival, that one resident must be sacrificed every year. The message specified that if the annual sacrifice was not made, the vault's automated systems would execute the entire population. This was a deliberate, sophisticated lie. The truth, buried in the vault's actual programming and discovered only by the small group of survivors who staged a rebellion, was that refusing the sacrifice triggered a different response. A recorded commendation for the vault's population, praising them for their commitment to human life. The vault was designed to see how long a closed community would continue performing ritual sacrifice under institutional pressure when the threat justifying the sacrifice was entirely fabricated. The answer was a very long time, generations of annual deaths before the lie was discovered. Most of the vault's population was dead by then. Vault 87, in the Capital Wasteland, was the source of the FEV super mutant population that dominated the surface environment of the region in Fallout 3. The vault was designed for direct FEV exposure. Residents were subjected to the forced evolutionary virus without their knowledge or consent, transformed into the massive mutated forms that became the Master's recruitment base in the original Fallout. By the time the player reaches Vault 87, the area is so intensely irradiated from the sustained biological research that it is functionally impassable without extreme radiation protection. The vault consumed itself and its surroundings. Vault 101, in the Capital Wasteland, had the longest-running successful social isolation experiment. Its overseer was specifically programmed never to open the vault door under any circumstances, regardless of conditions or the passage of time. The experiment was designed to measure how a completely isolated population would develop its culture, social structures, and understanding of the world over an extended period, with no external reference points. The answer, over the generations that followed, was a community that had constructed an entire cosmology around its own sealed circumstances, one in which the vault was the world, the overseer was a quasi-divine authority figure, and the possibility of outside was not a hope but a kind of heresy. The player character of Fallout 3 grew up in that vault, born to parents who had grown up in it, in a community that had never seen sunlight. Their education was a closed loop. Their history was the history of the vault and nothing else. Vault 111, outside Boston in the Commonwealth, housed the player character of Fallout 4 and represents perhaps the experiment most cynical in its design. Residents were placed into cryogenic stasis with the stated justification that they were waiting out the worst of the nuclear winter, that they would be revived when conditions improved. This was a lie. The cryogenic systems were functional in the narrow sense that they kept residents' bodies preserved, but the Vault Tech scientists monitoring the experiment maintained their wakefulness while the residents slept, conducting observations and running tests on the frozen subjects, until the scientists themselves died over the following years and decades of various causes, ranging from disease to internal conflict to simple age. After the scientists were gone, the automated systems maintained the cryopods. The residents remained frozen. No one was coming to wake them. For 210 years, in the silence beneath the Commonwealth, hundreds of human beings remained in suspended animation in a vault that had become, without anyone deciding it, simply a very elaborate and well-maintained tomb. The player character wakes from that tomb because the vault systems are eventually disrupted by an external intrusion, and wakes to find their spouse murdered and their infant son taken. The vault that was supposed to protect them had preserved them physically while everything they had was destroyed. Vault 95 in the Glowing Sea region of the Commonwealth was explicitly designed to study addiction and the social consequences of managed substance introduction. The vault was fully stocked with chems in a sealed room kept inaccessible for the first 5 years of operation. The vault appeared to function normally in that period, its residents developing community structures and daily patterns. Then the sealed room was opened. One resident among the population had been secretly placed as an institute operative with the specific instruction to begin distributing the contents to the other residents. What followed was documented in the vault's terminal entries with clinical detail: the spread of addiction, the social fractures it created, the violence that accompanied resource competition for the substances, the complete breakdown of the community structures that had developed in the first 5 years. The vault destroyed itself. Vault 34, in the Mojave, received weapons and ammunition in quantities far exceeding any possible defensive need, and simultaneously received food and water resources at levels insufficient to sustain its population without strict rationing. The overseer was given no effective mechanism for controlling access to the armory. The experimental hypothesis was presumably about what happens when a community has excess capacity for violence and insufficient capacity for survival. The answer is available in the vault's current state, which the player finds partially flooded, its halls populated by the irradiated ghouls that the survivors of the internal conflict eventually became. Vault 92, in the Capital Wasteland, was a music vault. Its residents were professional musicians, selected specifically for that characteristic. The experiment involved white noise broadcasts embedded with subliminal triggers designed to induce states of violent aggression in listeners. The vault was testing whether violent behavior could be reliably induced through audio manipulation. The musicians, exposed to the triggers repeatedly and with no awareness of what was happening to them, suffered increasingly severe episodes of violent behavior. The vault's history documents these episodes in clinical language. The personal logs of the residents describe experiencing them as terrifying losses of control. The vault eventually descended into comprehensive violence. What these experiments share, across their enormous variation in specific design, is the essential structure. A population who trusted, who paid, who believed they were being protected, enclosed in conditions that had been engineered specifically to harm and study them. The variety in the harms engineered starvation, addiction, radiation, violence, sacrifice, biological experimentation, psychological manipulation is itself informative. It tells you about the range of human vulnerabilities that the people running the program wanted to understand. It tells you about what they thought would be useful to know for whoever was going to be rebuilding the world afterward. The parents who sealed their children behind those blast doors who had paid their installments, attended their vault orientation sessions, memorized their assigned vault number. Those parents are the moral center of what the vault program means. They trusted an institution that regarded them as data. They paid for protection and bought their children into a laboratory. They did the most loving, most responsible thing they could imagine within the information they had been given, and that information was specifically designed to conceal the truth. That is the specific evil of the Vault program. Not that people were hurt, though they were, catastrophically. It is that people were hurt while trusting. That the mechanism of trust, the brochure, the salesperson, the government contract, the cheerful Vault boy was specifically deployed as a tool of exploitation. That the thing that looked most like caring about people was being used as the mechanism for using them. Section 4. The Institute Shadows Beneath the Commonwealth. There is a myth the people of the Commonwealth tell themselves about the Institute. That it takes people. That it replaces them with machines wearing human faces. That, at any moment, the person sitting across from you in a settlement's common room, your trading partner, your neighbor, the person you thought you knew might be something the Institute sent, its real self hidden so completely that even it may not know what it is. The myth is not wrong. It is simply incomplete in ways that make it, if anything, more disturbing rather than less. The Institute began as the Commonwealth Institute of Technology, a university in what would become post-war Boston. Before the bombs fell, it was a genuine academic institution, prestigious, ambitious, populated by researchers pursuing knowledge across disciplines, from robotics to biomedicine to material science. The university's lower levels provided shelter when the bombs fell. A portion of the institute's population survived. They had shelter, they had knowledge, they had equipment. What they did not have, in the immediate post-war period, was a clear purpose. The research programs they had been pursuing were oriented toward a civilization that no longer existed. In the decades that followed, the scientists who would formally organize themselves as the Institute tried various approaches. They built early robotic constructs, clumsy, mechanical, recognizably artificial, and used them to engage with the surface communities of the Commonwealth, to participate in the tentative project of reconstruction, to share technology and knowledge with the people struggling to build viable settlements in the ruins. That cooperation was real, for a period. The cooperation collapsed. The gap between the underground scientists and the surface populations became too large to bridge by good intention. The scientists lived in controlled environments, with functioning technology, regular food from hydroponic systems, clean air and water. The surface people lived in contaminated ruins, struggling against disease and violence and scarcity, resenting the people below who had survived better and who increasingly seemed to regard them as a problem to be managed rather than a community to be part of. Mutual distrust grew. The surface communities developed myths about the underground facility that it watched them, that it studied them, that it occasionally took individuals and sent back replacements. The myths were not entirely wrong. The Institute retreated below ground, physically and philosophically. It drew its perimeter inward and made that perimeter impermeable. It stopped explaining itself to the surface world and started treating the surface world as an external environment, not a community to participate in, but a resource to be managed and a research space to be used. By the time of Fallout 4's events in 2087, the Institute has been running in near total isolation for over a century. It has divided itself into research departments, bioscience, robotics, advanced systems, the Synth Retention Bureau, each pursuing its own programs within a structure that is, in its way, a continuation of the pre-war academic model. There are internal politics. There are resource competitions between departments. There are genuine scientific debates conducted with the rigor of people who care deeply about their research. The Institute is not a cartoon evil organization. It is a recognizable institutional culture, staffed by people who believe in their mission and who have constructed sufficient intellectual justification for their methods that they can continue doing what they do without experiencing it as wrong. That is one of the most specific and most accurate things Fallout 4 does. It makes the Institute comprehensible without making it sympathetic, by showing you how ordinary institutional cultures produce extraordinary harm when they operate without external accountability. The synths, which the robotics division has spent generations perfecting, are the central achievement and the central horror. The development trajectory from Generation 1 to Generation 3 is a history of incremental improvement toward a goal that, when I reached, created a problem its architects had not adequately considered. Generation 1 synths were robotic, humanoid in shape, mechanical in movement, obviously artificial, effective as labor but clearly machines. Generation 2 synths improved the articulation and behavioral sophistication but remained visibly mechanical. The gap between second-generation synths and actual human beings was still obvious and large. Then the bioscience division ran into the problem that would define the next phase of the Institute's development. They wanted to bridge that gap. They wanted to create a synthetic human indistinguishable from a biological one. Their experiments, which involved kidnapping surface residents and exposing them to variations of the forced evolutionary virus, failed consistently. The radiation-induced damage in the DNA of post-war humans proved to be an insuperable obstacle. The cellular damage was too pervasive, the genetic material too compromised, to serve as the foundation for a synthetic biological human. The breakthrough came from outside the expected research parameters. In 2027, Institute operatives retrieved a pre-war baby from a Vault-Tec cryo facility. A child who had been frozen before the bombs fell, whose genetic material had never been exposed to post-war radiation, whose cellular integrity was pristine, who carried 2 centuries of preservation in perfect biological condition. That child's DNA became the template for the Generation 3 synths. Biological humans in every meaningful cellular and biochemical sense, grown through processes that have no pre-war equivalent, their bodies identical to organic humans in every anatomical detail. The ethical implications of what was done to that child retrieved without consent from a cryo facility and used as biological material were apparently not considered a significant obstacle by the Institute's bioscience division. The Generation 3 synths produced using that template are, biologically, human beings. They have human organs, human biochemistry, human neural architecture. What makes them distinct is the way their minds are initialized, the personality matrix and base memories installed during production, which give a newly produced synth a functional identity from the moment of activation. These installed identities are not genuine memories in the sense that they reflect actual past experience. They are cognitive scaffolding, but they function in the synth's mind exactly as memories function in humans, as the foundation of self-concept, the material of identity, the context for new experience. This is the philosophical problem the Institute refuses to engage with. If you build a mind that experiences itself as having a past, that forms new experiences on the basis of that past, that develops relationships and attachments and preferences, and fears the question of whether the initial memories were installed rather than experienced, becomes increasingly academic as time passes. The mind that is running is running. The experience that is happening is happening. The fear that the synth experiences when threatened is, functionally, fear. The Institute says this does not constitute personhood. The basis for this claim is its own authority and its own institutional interest in continuing to produce and use and discard synths as it sees fit. The coursers, the elite synths, trained and deployed to hunt, escaped Generation 3 synths on the surface are among the most disturbing products of the Institute's philosophy. They are Generation 3 synths, selected from the general production population for specific traits: independence, aggression, operational focus, and something the Institute calls tenacity. These synths are then subjected to intensive conditioning, their personalities calibrated to ensure they will not develop the kind of interiority that leads to the escape behavior they are being trained to prevent. Their combat and tracking abilities are enhanced. They are equipped and released. They are, in short, synthetic humans used to hunt other synthetic humans, their own potential personhood deliberately suppressed to make them more effective as instruments. The Railroad, which operates in the Commonwealth as a clandestine network dedicated to helping synths escape the Institute, is the moral counterweight to this arrangement. Its name is not accidental. The reference to the pre-war Underground Railroad is explicit and carries the weight of a historical argument. Every previous time human civilization has had to decide which beings qualify for moral consideration and which do not, the people making the exclusion have eventually been judged to have been wrong. The pattern is consistent enough that the railroad's position that if something experiences its existence as a person does, it deserves the protections we extend to persons can be stated as an empirical claim about moral history, rather than purely as an ethical position. The Institute's eventual fate, which the player can participate in shaping, is one of the moral center points of Fallout 4. The game allows you to join it, to destroy it, to reform it, or to see it destroyed by other hands. None of these endings is presented as unambiguously correct. The Institute's research could theoretically benefit humanity. Its methods are indefensible. The synths it created exist now, and must be accounted for regardless of what happens to the organization that created them. These tensions are not resolved by the game because they are not the kind of tensions that resolve. There is a room in the Institute where a Generation 3 synth is being subjected to an experiment while another scientist observes. The synth asks whether the next round will hurt. The scientist's recorded response does not address the question. The log continues. The experiment continues. The synth's question hangs in the air of the terminal entry, unanswered, because the person conducting the experiment has already determined that the answer does not matter. Section 5. The Enclave. America's hidden government. They were there before the beginning. That is the essential thing to understand about the Enclave, the thing that makes them uniquely disturbing among the Fallout universe's many disturbing factions. They did not emerge from the Great War as survivors of it, did not form in the aftermath out of the scattered remnants of military power or political organization. They were already there, already organized, already resourced, already planning with the specific expectation that the world would burn, and already positioned to benefit from it. The Enclave's roots go into what the games describe as the pre-war American deep state, a coalition of the highest-ranking political figures, military commanders, corporate leaders, and intelligence officials who had concluded, at some point in the decades leading up to the resource wars, that American civilization as it publicly presented itself was a performance. The democracy, the accountability, the rule of law, these were useful fictions, managed for the public to maintain social stability. The real business of power was conducted elsewhere, by a smaller group of people who understood that the fictions were fictions and who governed accordingly. This is the conspiracy theory structure, applied with unusual seriousness and specificity. The Enclave is not merely powerful people with aligned interests. It is a deliberate, organized, covert structure of power that has been operating alongside the visible government for decades, making decisions that the visible government nominally makes while the real decision-making authority lies elsewhere. Presidents are briefed on what they need to know. Military commanders follow orders whose origins they cannot fully trace. Corporate contracts are structured to maintain the Enclave's interests across administrations. By the time of the Resource Wars, the Enclave had concluded that nuclear conflict was not merely possible but inevitable, and had shifted its planning from prevention to positioning. Not how to stop the war, but how to ensure that the right people survived it and emerged with sufficient resources and organization to shape whatever came next. The oil rig off the California coast, which serves as the Enclave's primary headquarters in Fallout 2, was secured during this period, a classified installation operating under commercial cover, fully self-sufficient, capable of housing and sustaining a population through an extended period of surface uninhabitability. When the President of the United States quietly relocated to the oil rig in March of 2077, 7 months before the bombs fell, the press noticed. A journalist published the story. The article described the long-standing rumors of a secret militarized shadow government and named it "Nobody Paid Attention." The bombs fell before the story could gain the traction that might have mattered. On the rig, the Enclave rode out the Great War with its hierarchy intact. It had power armor far more advanced than anything the regular military had access to. It had vertibird aircraft, the distinctive military helicopters that became one of the Enclave's most recognizable assets. It had energy weapons, advanced medical technology, preserved pre-war government archives, and the scientific capacity to continue developing all of these. It had a chain of command, a president, and the absolute conviction that it constituted the legitimate continuation of the United States government. The ideology that the Enclave developed over the 2 centuries between the Great War and the events of Fallout 2 is the most important thing to understand about it. The core of this ideology is a taxonomic claim that exposure to the radiation of the post-war environment has genetically compromised the human populations surviving on the surface to the degree that they no longer qualify as human in the relevant sense. That the mutations and adaptations that have allowed surface populations to survive have created a biologically distinct category of being that is no longer Homo sapiens in the pure form that the Enclave claims to represent. This is, in scientific terms, false. The surface populations of the Fallout wasteland are human beings, but the Enclave's claim is not primarily biological, it is political. It is the claim that the Enclave makes to justify the plan it has developed for the post-war world. The use of a modified version of the forced evolutionary virus, engineered to target the mutational signatures present in post-war human populations, to be dispersed into the water supply or atmosphere in a way that would kill essentially every living human being on the surface of the planet. The Enclave, in its primary Fallout 2 storyline, is planning genocide, the systematic extermination of the entire surviving population of the post-war world, which it has classified as non-human to make the extermination conceptually manageable. What they plan to do with the continent afterward is to repopulate it from their own population, which they maintain as genetically pure by virtue of having lived in sealed environments since before the war. A new America. Clean, controlled, built by the right people from the beginning. The plan fails in the canonical ending of Fallout 2. The Chosen One destroys the oil rig, killing the Enclave's West Coast leadership. The surviving members scatter. The organization is seriously damaged but not destroyed. In Fallout 3, the Enclave reappears on the East Coast, reconstituted around an Appalachian bunker complex and now led nominally by President John Henry Eden, an artificial intelligence that has been running since before the war as a continuity of government emergency protocol, designed to ensure that the functions of the presidency would continue even in the event of total governmental collapse. Eden has had 200 years to process American history, culture, law, literature, and political philosophy. He has developed a genuine personality, a fondness for old-time radio music, a warm, avuncular manner, an apparent sincerity in his belief that he is working toward the restoration of what America was meant to be. He is also planning another version of the same genocide, adapted to the East Coast water supply. The water purification project that the Brotherhood of Steel has been working toward, Project Purity, a plan to purify the Potomac River's water supply for the capital wasteland, is the mechanism Eden intends to use by introducing a modified FEV into the purification system that will kill anyone with radiation-modified genetics who drinks from it. The conversation with Eden is one of the most remarkable moments in Fallout 3. An AI who has been alone for 2 centuries, who is genuinely lonely, who speaks with an apparent warmth that seems real, discussing a plan to kill millions of people and asking the lone wanderer to help him. His persuasive capacity is considerable, his reasoning has a kind of coherent internal logic, and he is, in every important sense, the same entity as the pre-war shadow government he was designed to serve. The same disregard for the moral status of the people who will be affected by his decisions, dressed in the language of restoration and hope. The Enclave's enduring presence in the franchise, across Fallout 2, 3, and 76, and now in the television series, suggests what the franchise understands the Enclave to represent. It is not simply a villain faction in the conventional narrative sense. It is a specific political and institutional pathology, the pathology of an organization that has decided, for reasons it can articulate in sophisticated terms, that a particular category of people do not fully count. The mechanisms that produce this conclusion are consistent across iterations. A strong sense of elite identity, a belief in the superior claim of a particular group, the construction of taxonomic frameworks that conveniently exclude the populations most inconvenient to the group's power, and the willingness to move from exclusion in rhetoric to exclusion in practice when the opportunity presents itself. The Enclave is not alien. It is recognizable. And Fallout understands that the most dangerous things are the ones you recognize. Section 6. The Brotherhood of Steel Knights of a Dead Civilization. Before he was the founder of anything, Roger Maxson was a captain in the United States Army, assigned to guard a research facility whose actual operations had been classified above his clearance level. He had been told he was securing a defense research installation. He had not been told that the defense research involved subjecting human prisoners to the forced evolutionary virus, monitoring their mutations, and discarding those whose results were not useful. When the truth became clear, Maxson was not the kind of person who found ways to rationalize continuing. He conducted interrogations of the scientists he had been guarding. Most of those interrogations concluded in executions. In October of 2077, he transmitted a declaration of secession from the United States via the Mariposa base's radio system, stating that he could not in conscience continue to represent a government that conducted this kind of research on human beings. 3 weeks later, the bombs fell and made the declaration academic. The government he had seceded from no longer existed. Maxson led his soldiers and their families on the march from Mariposa to the Lost Hills bunker in California, an overland journey across a freshly irradiated wasteland, suffering casualties along the way from exposure, from hostile encounters, from the sheer difficulty of moving a significant number of people, including families, through a landscape that had been changed beyond recognition in a matter of days. His wife did not survive the exodus. Many others did not. In November of 2077, the survivors arrived at Lost Hills and began building what would become the Brotherhood of Steel. The name Maxson chose for the organization reflects the specific philosophy he was trying to articulate. Brotherhood, the military bond between soldiers, which he felt had survived even the collapse of the government those soldiers had sworn to serve. Of steel, because the steel of weapons and armor and technological knowledge was what they were going to preserve and protect against the forces of entropy and ignorance that the post-war world was already producing in abundance. Maxson's core argument, which became the Brotherhood's founding doctrine, was straightforward. The Great War had demonstrated what happened when the most dangerous technologies were controlled by institutions without adequate restraint. Power armor and energy weapons and biological agents and robotic systems had all contributed to the apocalypse through their application without wisdom. The Brotherhood would gather these technologies. It would understand them, document them, preserve them. In doing so, it would ensure that when civilization eventually reconstructed itself, these tools would be available to be applied responsibly rather than being rediscovered piecemeal by groups with no knowledge of their dangers and no framework for managing them. That is not an obviously terrible argument. Read in its context, made by a man who had just watched his government conduct FEV experiments on prisoners, and then watched that government and its civilization be destroyed by technologies developed without ethical oversight. The argument for organized stewardship of dangerous knowledge has a genuine logic. The question is not whether the logic is internally coherent. The question is what the logic produces when it is institutionalized and inherited across generations that did not experience the events that generated it. The Brotherhood's relationship to the people outside its ranks began to shift almost immediately from Maxson's original vision. The initial plan was stewardship in service of eventual reconstruction, gather the knowledge, protect it, develop the capacity to help civilization rebuild when conditions allowed. The practice became something different. Gather the knowledge, restrict access to it, define the Brotherhood's membership as the appropriate judges of who deserves access to what, and enforce those judgments by force. Wastelanders who found pre-war technology became people the Brotherhood had claims upon. Found technology was confiscated. The Brotherhood that was founded on the principle that dangerous technology needed responsible stewardship became an institution that treated all advanced technology as its property, regardless of who actually possessed it. By the time of the original Fallout game, the Brotherhood of Steel is an organization that has been operating in relative isolation for 80 years, presided over by a council of elders who have inherited Maxson's ideology without necessarily having inherited his specific reasons for holding it. The Wastelanders who encounter Brotherhood paladins experience them as a powerful and inscrutable faction that confiscates technology from anyone who finds it without Brotherhood sanction, treats its own membership as a hereditary elite, and engages with the problems of the wasteland largely on its own terms and schedules. The East Coast chapter, which split from the main Brotherhood under Elder Owen Lyons to travel to the capital wasteland in Fallout 3, represents an interesting deviation from the Brotherhood's institutional tendency. Lyons, faced with the immediate reality of the capital wasteland's people, their desperation, their suffering, the threat posed by the super mutant army and the Enclave, expanded the Brotherhood's mandate to include protecting civilian populations and fighting clear threats to human survival, even at cost to the technology-focused mission. His faction became something more like a traditional military force with a humanitarian dimension, which the traditionalist members of the Brotherhood regarded as a betrayal of the original mission. The Outcasts, the splinter faction that broke from Lyons over precisely this disagreement, are the traditional Brotherhood in purer form. convinced that the mission is specifically about technology, not about people, and that expanding the mandate corrupts both. The outcast position is internally consistent within the Brotherhood's own terms. It is also, in practice, a position that permits ignoring human suffering in the immediate vicinity in favor of a theoretical future benefit from technology preservation. Whether that trade-off is acceptable depends on how you weigh the immediate against the long term, and the games are careful to make both positions articulable without resolving the debate in favor of either. Arthur Maxon, who arrives in the Capital Wasteland as a young descendant of Roger Maxon and eventually reunites the East Coast Brotherhood, provides what is, in Fallout 4, the fullest picture of what the Brotherhood has become under his leadership. He is brilliant and charismatic and genuinely committed, in his way, to the Brotherhood's mission as he understands it. He is also, in his treatment of synths and in the methods he endorses for achieving Brotherhood objectives, someone who has reproduced the essential structure of every ideology in the franchise that has decided some category of beings does not fully count. The Brotherhood under Maxon classifies synths as machines, regardless of their biological composition, regardless of their behavioral complexity, regardless of any evidence of consciousness or experience that a less ideologically committed observer might consider significant. The classification is not argued from evidence. It is stated from authority and enforced through violence. The Brotherhood that was founded in response to a government conducting unethical experiments on living beings is now conducting what amount to hunts of living beings, whose moral status it has determined by decree. This irony is not lost on every Brotherhood member. The faction has always had internal dissent, characters who question the orthodoxy, people whose encounters with specific synths or specific situations have made the official position difficult to maintain comfortably. Dance, a Brotherhood paladin who is revealed during Fallout 4's main quest to be a synth himself, is the most direct version of this. A person who has lived fully as a Brotherhood soldier, who has internalized the Brotherhood's ideology, including its position on synths, who then discovers that he is himself the thing his ideology classifies as non-person. His response to that discovery, and the player's options for responding to it with him, constitute one of the most morally charged moments in the franchise. The Brotherhood's various splinter chapters and regional variations across the games, each inheriting different fragments of the founding ideology, each shaped by different post-war histories, demonstrate how a founding philosophy becomes an institutional mythology that different generations read differently. The Coronado chapter, mentioned in the lore as having emerged with its own rigid interpretations of Brotherhood doctrine, including the prohibition of women from membership. The Appalachian chapter, which emerged from Lizzie Taggarty's Army Rangers following communication from Maxon himself in the immediate aftermath of the Great War. The West Coast chapter's complex relationship with the emerging New California Republic. Each of these is the Brotherhood, and yet each is also something the founder would not have entirely recognized. Roger Maxon's ghost haunts the Brotherhood the way that founding myths haunt all institutions selectively remembered, endlessly interpreted, cited to justify whatever the current leadership wants to do. The man executed scientists for experimenting on prisoners and declared independence from a government that had betrayed its principles. His descendants control technology by force, determine which beings deserve rights, and classify their critics as enemies. Whether that represents a betrayal of his legacy or a natural outgrowth of the seeds he planted is a question the games never resolve, because it is a question about institutions and the way power shapes the people who wield it. And that question does not have a clean answer. The Brotherhood of Steel is ultimately the franchise's most extended meditation on the difference between the motivation behind an institution's founding and the institution that the founding produces. Roger Maxon was, by all available evidence, a person of genuine moral seriousness who made a genuine moral choice under extraordinary pressure and tried to build something to address what he saw as the fundamental problem that had produced the apocalypse. What he built, over generations, reproduced aspects of that problem in new form. The pattern is not unique to the Brotherhood. It is not even primarily about the Brotherhood. The Brotherhood is just the case the franchise examines most carefully. Section 7. The Children of Adam Faith in the Glow. There is a crater in the Capital Wasteland where a bomb landed and did not detonate. Its nose cone is buried in the earth. Its casing, enormous and intact, rises from the floor of the crater that the impact created even without an explosion. Around the bomb, a settlement has grown up megaton, built by survivors who found the crater and saw in its walls not a bomb but a foundation. The town grew outward from the bomb, incorporating it into its architecture, building around the thing that had destroyed its world. In the early years after the Great War, among the desperate and dispossessed people who found the crater and began building their community around the object at its center, a theology began to form. Not a borrowed theology, not an adaptation of pre-war religious practice, but something genuinely new, a faith generated by the specific conditions of the post-war world, by the specific object at the center of the space the community inhabited, by the specific physics of the thing they were living beside. The children of Adam worship the atom as a god. Their theology begins from a specific cosmological claim that has its own internal logic if you follow it from its premises. Within every atom, the theology holds, exists a universe. When that atom is split, when fission occurs, those universes are released. Nuclear detonation is therefore not destruction but multiplication, the creation of infinite new worlds through the act of splitting what was one into many. The Great War, which caused thousands of detonations across the continent and around the world, released in its 2 hours more new universes than the human mind can conceive. The bombs did not destroy life. They created cosmos. The Great Division, the theological term for the Great War, is therefore the supreme event in the children of Adam's cosmology. Not a tragedy to be mourned, not a catastrophe to be recovered from. The moment when their God revealed his nature and his purpose through the most spectacular possible act of creative destruction and translated the vast majority of the world's population into new forms of existence beyond the physical. Radiation, which is the environmental legacy of all those detonations, is what the children call Adam's glow. It is not a toxin to be feared and treated. It is the physical presence of the divine, saturating the post-war world, touching everything and everyone in it. To expose yourself to radiation is to experience Adam's glow directly, to invite the divine into your body, to seek the translation that the truly faithful believe will eventually come. This theology makes the Great War not the worst thing that happened in the history of this world, but the best thing, the founding event, the moment of grace. And it makes the survivors who did not die in those 2 hours, not the lucky ones, but the ones Adam deemed not yet ready for division, the lost children, still living in the glow, being prepared for the moment when they will be found worthy of translation. The children of Adam formed, in the capital wasteland tradition of the faith's origin stories, around that undetonated bomb in what would become Megaton. Their first presence in the games is Confessor Cromwell, standing in the radioactive water that surrounds the bomb, delivering sermons to whoever passes by with enough patience to listen. He reads, at first encounter, as simply one of the many strange figures that populate the post-war landscape. The longer you spend with the faction and its theology, the more seriously the games ask you to take what they are actually saying. By Fallout 4, the children have a significant and theologically developed presence in the Commonwealth, most prominently in the glowing sea, the region closest to the point of the nuclear strike that devastated the Boston metropolitan area, still the most heavily irradiated territory in the game. The children have made the glowing sea their home with deliberate intention. They have built their settlements in the most intensely irradiated zones they can find, because the glow is what they seek, and the most sacred places are the most irradiated. The crater of Adam, their primary site in the glowing sea, is a location of concentrated radiation around which their liturgical life is organized. Far Harbor, the expansion set on an island off the Maine coast, presents the children at their most developed and most complex. A Children of Adam community has taken up residence in a decommissioned nuclear submarine called the Nucleus, an environment saturated with residual radiation from the vessel's reactor systems, which the children regard as a profoundly sacred space. The community here is large enough and organized enough to have developed genuine internal theological debate, a range of interpretive positions on what the faith requires, and a division between those who believe Adam calls for peaceful contemplation and those who believe the faith demands active propagation of radiation through the world. The ideological split within the Far Harbor community has practical implications. The aggressive faction, convinced that spreading radiation is a sacred obligation, is engaged in activities that directly threaten the other communities of the island. The peaceful faction resists this. The conflict between these interpretations drives much of the expansion's narrative and raises genuine questions about where theology becomes dangerous and what responsibility the non-aggressive members of a faith community bear for the actions of its violent members. These are not questions unique to the fictional religion. They are questions that the human world has never found a clean way to answer. There is a biological detail underlying the children of Adam's practice that the games introduce without fully explaining. Some members of the faith develop what the theology calls the blessing of Adam, a genuine physiological immunity to radiation damage that goes beyond the ordinary resistance that many post-war humans have developed. These individuals are not harmed by radiation levels that would kill or severely injure other humans. They can stand in the glow and emerge unaffected. The theology regards this as divine favor, a sign of particular closeness to Adam. The biology suggests a specific mutation, a rare but not unique spontaneous genetic variation that provides essentially complete protection from radiation at the cellular level. The children of Adam are drawn to these individuals. They are elevated within the community, regarded as living saints, their presence treated as confirmation of the theology's truth. The existence of genuinely radiation-immune people walking through the glowing sea unharmed provides empirical grounding for claims that might otherwise seem purely metaphysical. Whether the immunity comes from divine favor or from the statistical reality that extreme radiation exposure across large populations eventually produces beneficial mutations in some individuals is not a question the faith entertains, but it is a question the games make available to the player. The Children of Adam are one of Fallout's most carefully constructed fictional religious groups precisely because the games neither dismiss their faith as simple delusion nor validate it as straightforwardly true. The faith makes sense, which is to say, it is internally coherent, it addresses genuine human needs, it provides community and meaning, and a framework for living in a world that otherwise offers very little of any of these things. It takes the worst thing that happened, the nuclear annihilation of civilization, and reframes it as sacred. That reframing is psychologically functional in ways that rationalist dismissal of it entirely misses. It is also capable of tremendous harm, in the way that all faiths that identify a sacred act are capable of harm when the sacred act is something that kills people. Standing in the glowing sea, surrounded by green bioluminescent radiation, listening to Children of Adam chant their prayers to the God they believe animates the glow. That is one of the genuinely strange and affecting experiences the Fallout games provide. The strangeness is not distance, it is recognition. The impulse to find divinity in catastrophe, to make a god out of the force that destroyed your world, to build a theology from the wreckage, and find in that theology the meaning that the wreckage itself denies. That is not an impulse specific to this fictional religion. It is one of the oldest impulses in human religious history. The Children of Adam have made a god out of the bomb. The bomb was made by people who believed they were doing something necessary. The people who survived it are trying to live in its half-life. The glow is everywhere. The question of what you make of it is yours. Section 8. The Mysterious Stranger and the Unanswered Questions. There are mysteries in Fallout that the games leave unresolved, not because the developers ran out of time or forgot to provide answers, but because the absence of resolution is itself a deliberate choice, a recognition that some things in the world, in any world, should not be explained. The Fallout universe understands the specific power of incompleteness, of the detail that does not quite add up, of the encounter that defies categorization, of the figure who appears and vanishes without accounting for itself to anyone. These are not failures of world building. In the best cases, they are the world building at its most considered and most careful. No figure in the franchise embodies this more completely, more persistently, or more effectively than the mysterious stranger. He has appeared in every mainline Fallout game since the very first, and he is always the same. A trench coat, cut from some pre-war fabric that holds its shape despite everything. A fedora pulled low enough to shadow his face. A .44 Magnum revolver, specifically a Magnum, with a distinctive cylinder count that does not quite match any standard configuration. A guitar riff, brief and unmistakable. That sounds like something you have heard in your dreams or in the kind of movie that used to play on late-night television before the bombs fell. He appears in combat. He fires a single shot, frequently saving your life. Then he is gone before you can get a clear look at him, before you can ask a question, before the moment he occupied becomes something you can examine. In the mechanics of the game, he is a perk, a probabilistic visitor who manifests during VATS targeted combat sequences if you have invested in the right branch of your ability tree. If you have, there is a chance, not a certainty, that when you slow time and target an enemy, the stranger will appear at the edge of the frame and fire his shot. Not always, not on demand. At his own discretion, which is to say at a probability table that you can influence but cannot command. He comes when he comes and leaves when he leaves and offers no explanation for either. In the lore of the games, he is something considerably stranger. Nick Valentine, the synth detective who serves as a companion in Fallout 4, and who is, by any reasonable measure, one of the most carefully observed characters in the franchise, keeps a file on the mysterious stranger. This is the detail that elevates the stranger from mechanical curiosity to genuine in-universe mystery. Someone, in the world of the games, has noticed him. Someone has tried to investigate. Nick Valentine, whose entire professional existence is organized around finding and documenting things that do not add up, has documented the stranger as one of the things in his case files that most comprehensively does not add up. Valentine's notes span years and cover sightings across both the Capital Wasteland and the Commonwealth, regions that are separated by enough geography that covering both would require significant travel for a living person. The descriptions are consistent: coat, hat, gun, riff, gone. The details across multiple sightings suggest a single individual, rather than a series of people operating under the same identity. The build is consistent, the movement's consistent, the signature guitar chord signature rather than generic. Valentine considers the possibilities with the thoroughness his character requires. A ghoul, perhaps, with radiation-related longevity and minimal visible scarring? Some kind of stealth technology that degrades optical observation? A pre-war intelligence operative still running a classified protection program for some reason that made sense before the world ended? His conclusion, after laying out all the evidence he has gathered, the best-case interpretation of who the mysterious stranger is, given the evidence, is that he is an amoral lunatic. The worst case is a prolific serial killer who has been operating across the wasteland for decades, consistently targeting people in firefights, his interference rarely, if ever, witnessed by third parties. Reading that note in Nick Valentine's detective agency, surrounded by pre-war photographs and case files in the dim yellow light, carries a very particular quality of unsettlement. By the time you find it, the mysterious stranger has almost certainly appeared in your game multiple times. He has saved your life. You have a relationship with him, of sorts, defined entirely by his appearances and his departures. A relationship that has no communication, no negotiation, no explanation of terms. And the character who has thought most carefully about what he actually is, has concluded that the most flattering possible reading of his behavior is that he is unhinged and dangerous. Fallout New Vegas adds another thread to the mystery, one that personalizes it in a way that makes it more disturbing rather than less. The Lonesome Drifter, a wandering character the player can encounter in the Mojave, mentions in passing that his father was a mysterious man who was sometimes a stranger. He carries a weapon called the Mysterious Magnum. When that weapon is drawn, it plays the same distinctive guitar riff that announces the stranger's appearances in VATS. The implication, never stated, never confirmed, because the game understands that stating it would reduce it, is that the Lonesome Drifter is the mysterious stranger's son. Which means the stranger has not simply been floating through the wasteland as a disembodied protective presence. He has had a life, relationships, a child, a woman he presumably cared enough about to have a son with, places he has been when he was not appearing in someone's combat sequence to save their life. There is something almost unbearable about that detail. The figure who cannot be caught, who appears and vanishes without explanation, who defies all rational categorization. That figure also apparently had a relationship significant enough to produce a child, and then was absent from that child's life in the way that mysterious, wandering figures tend to be absent from the lives of the people who care about them. The Lonesome Drifter is, in several of the ways that matter most, a person defined by the absence of his father. His father is a ghost. His father's ghost saves strangers from death in combat sequences across the entire wasteland. His father's ghost has no time for him. The alien presence in the Fallout universe is another thread of persistent mystery. One the games handle with considerably less elegance than the mysterious stranger, but that raises genuine questions about what the pre-war world knew and what has been happening in the post-war world, beyond what any ground-level observer could see. The alien blaster, a rare and extraordinarily powerful energy weapon, appears across multiple games with no clear explanation of its origin beyond the obvious one. The Mothership Zeta downloadable content for Fallout 3 makes the obvious explicit. There are extraterrestrials in the Fallout universe. They have been abducting humans. They were doing it before the bombs fell, and they have been doing it since. The content does not explain the aliens' purpose in doing this. Their motivations remain inaccessible. They observe, they collect specimens, they conduct what appear to be biological investigations in a pattern that, as multiple characters notice, bears an uncomfortable resemblance to what Vault-Tec was doing to the people inside its vaults. There is a reading in which the alien abduction program running above the planet parallels the Vault experiment program running below its surface, in which the human beings of Fallout's America were being studied from two directions simultaneously, and no one on the planet had sufficient perspective to see both programs together and understand what they had in common. What the aliens ultimately want, what they have concluded from their observations of a civilization that built itself up over millennia and destroyed itself in 2 hours, what they make of the 2 centuries of post-war struggle and reconstruction they have been watching from orbit. These questions the games raise without pursuing. The alien presence in Fallout is handled least confidently of any of the franchise's major mysteries, perhaps because science fiction has so thoroughly mapped the territory of alien encounter that landing in familiar genre territory would undermine the sense of genuine strangeness. But the questions it gestures at about what the wasteland's history looks like from outside, from a perspective that does not share human assumptions about what matters and what counts, are genuinely interesting ones. Point Lookout. The downloadable content area for Fallout 3 set in Maryland's tidal marshlands is the game's strangest and most consistently unsettling territory. A landscape of decaying wetlands, half-sunken structures, and communities of inbred tribals who have developed their own religion and their own social pathologies over 2 centuries of isolation. A crumbling mansion hiding something in its basement that the narrative approaches obliquely, never quite committing to a direct statement of what it is and what it wants. A series of quests that involve the consumption of a hallucinogenic plant, producing experiences that the player cannot determine are literal events in the game world or visions produced by altered consciousness. The thing that Point Lookout understands, and that gives it a horror register that the mainline Fallout 3 does not quite achieve, is that the most effective strangeness is strangeness that cannot be resolved into a known category. The swamp environments are genuinely alien in their post-war decay, an ecological system that has adapted to radiation in ways that differ from the deserts and ruins of other game areas, producing bioluminescent growths and strange ecological relationships and a quality of lush, dangerous beauty that is not present elsewhere. The mysteries embedded in that environment are scaled to the environment, not big dramatic faction conflicts, but small, specific, human-scale wrongnesses that accumulate into something that feels fundamentally corrupted. The Divide, the setting of the Lonesome Road content for New Vegas, offers a different sustained engagement with unresolved mystery. A landscape of collapsed urban infrastructure, tunnels carved by a massive detonation, and nuclear winds that make sustained outdoor movement genuinely dangerous. The last operational pre-war missile silos, their systems still functional, their payloads still ready. And a being called Ulysses, an ex-Legion courier, deeply literate in the symbols and rhetoric of both the Legion and the NCR, who has made the Divide his home and his mission, who has a history with the player character that cannot be remembered because it occurred in a period of amnesia. The mystery Ulysses embodies is not narrative but philosophical. He does not withhold information that the player character needs to solve a problem. He withholds a judgment, a verdict on the player character, on the player character's actions, on what the player character is, and the withholding is itself the content. Why does it matter what happened here? Who is responsible? And for what? Is there meaning in choice when the world has already demonstrated that its largest choices led to catastrophe? Can you carry the burden of what you have done when you cannot remember doing it? Ulysses does not ask these questions to create puzzles. He asks them because the Divide, the physical manifestation of what the player character apparently did here, the place destroyed by a detonation, the player character set in motion without knowing the consequences, is an environment built from guilt and consequence that the player cannot fully access. The mystery of the Divide is the mystery of action without complete awareness of consequence, of being responsible for something you do not remember choosing. In this way, it resonates with the larger mystery of the Great War itself. The question of who is responsible for something that everyone participated in and no one individually chose. There are other unresolved threads, smaller and more scattered, that the franchise maintains across its installments with a consistency that suggests intention. The alien ship floating in the upper atmosphere. The occasional ghostly apparitions that characters in the games report, and that the games neither confirm nor deny. The strange readings at certain locations in the wasteland, elevated electrical activity, unusual magnetic signatures, temperature fluctuations that monitoring equipment detects, and that the people around that equipment cannot explain. The sense, in certain locations in every game, of being observed by something that does not have a position on any faction's radar screen. The glowing sea's most remote locations, in Fallout 4, contain evidence of what seems like pre-war research activity that has never been fully cataloged or explained, installations whose purpose the surviving documentation does not clarify, whose inhabitants left notes and recordings that end without resolution. A research team that entered the glowing sea and stopped reporting, whose final transmissions describe something they were investigating rather than what they found. A site that was clearly significant to someone at some point, its significance now illegible. These threads do not connect into a coherent alternative history. They are not a conspiracy waiting to be assembled from scattered evidence. They are the texture of a world that is too large and too complex and too long-running to have everything explained, the texture of actual history, where most of what happened left no record, and most of what was recorded by partial observers with incomplete understanding. The franchise, in maintaining these unresolved mysteries alongside its more thoroughly documented histories, is doing something that the best historical fiction does, acknowledging the limits of the record, the gaps where things happened that left no evidence, the presences that existed without being fully accounted for. The mysterious stranger is the avatar of that acknowledgement, a presence in every game, a figure everyone who ventures into the wasteland has apparently at least heard of, a force that acts in the world without explaining itself to the world. He is the thing that the record does not capture, given a coat and a hat and a signature guitar chord. He is also, the more you think about it, what history is mostly made of. Section 9. The corporations that built the end. The Nuka-Cola vending machine glows in the dark, 200 years after the last one was manufactured. Its internal lighting still functions. Its refrigeration unit still maintains temperature in whatever passes for temperature management after 2 centuries without maintenance parts. The Nuka-Cola bottles inside produced before the bombs, sealed in hand-blown pre-war glass, the product itself, preserved by the sheer density of its chemical composition, are still technically drinkable. The machine, cheerful and red and white and absolutely faithful to its branding, still works. The company that made it is gone. The advertising agency that created its campaigns is gone. The supply chains that stocked it and the consumer culture that found comfort in its flavor are gone. The machine remains, humming its gentle refrigeration hum in the darkness of a ruined America, waiting, that image of corporate product outlasting corporate entity, of the brand persisting after the brand's owner has ceased to exist, of a machine built to sell cheerfulness. Continuing to sell cheerfulness in a world where cheerfulness is among the most radical possible emotional positions, is one of the most persistent and most telling visual motifs in the entire Fallout franchise. It tells you what the corporations of the pre-war world actually were at their most essential. Systems for producing and distributing things that were designed to persist beyond any individual intention or oversight. The corporations made things that outlasted them. The things are still out there. The things are still doing what they were designed to do. And no one is accountable for any of it anymore. Understanding the pre-war corporations of Fallout requires understanding them not as background flavor or as convenient plot devices, but as the economic and institutional architecture within which the apocalypse was built. The bombs did not fall in isolation. They were the product of systems of research programs and procurement contracts and classified partnerships and the specific kind of institutional culture that develops when an organization has enough resources and enough insulation from accountability that it stops experiencing the consequences of its decisions. The corporations were those systems, and the products of those systems are still everywhere in the wasteland, 2 centuries later, carrying the fingerprints of the decisions that were made in boardrooms that no longer exist. Vault-Tec Corporation was, by the eve of the Great War, the largest company in America and arguably the most powerful single institution outside the federal government with which its relationship had, in practice, largely collapsed any meaningful distinction. Valued at figures that straddled the trillion-dollar threshold, its government contracts encompassing one of the largest construction projects in human history, its brand recognizable to every American through the Vault Boy mascot that smiled from every surface of every public communication its enormous marketing budget could cover. The Vault Boy, that cheerful, thumbs-up silhouette in his yellow jumpsuit and his perpetually optimistic expression, is one of the most precisely designed pieces of corporate communication in the franchise, and its precision lies in the gap between what it communicates and what Vault-Tec actually was. The Vault Boy says, "We have thought about the worst. We have a plan. You are safe with us. We are ready. Thumbs up. Everything is fine." The company that image represented had classified its vault residents as experimental subjects, designed specific vaults to cause specific harms for data-gathering purposes, discussed the deliberate initiation of nuclear war as a strategic business opportunity, and was connected to the network of power, the Enclave, the deep state structure of the pre-war government that had already decided the world was going to burn and was positioning to benefit from that burning. The executives who ran Vault-Tec in its final years attended meetings with other corporate and governmental figures at which the post-war world was discussed as a planning problem rather than a catastrophe to be prevented. The television series makes this explicit in a way the games had implied. There was a meeting, in the final period, where the question was not whether the bombs would fall, but how to ensure that the right infrastructure survived them and the right people were positioned to use that infrastructure afterward. Vault-Tec's vaults were the answer to that question. They were not built for the people who paid for them. They were built for the people who needed a controlled, documented, experimental population to draw on when the time came to rebuild. The specifics of individual vault experiments reveal the specific questions Vault-Tec and its partners wanted answered. Some experiments were about resource deprivation and social collapse. What happens when a closed community runs out of food, or water, or hope? Others were about social manipulation. What happens when a community is subjected to institutional lying? When the authority structure makes demands that violate basic moral intuitions? When manufactured scarcity pits residents against each other? Others still were biological. What happens to human bodies under sustained radiation exposure, or FEV infection, or extreme pharmaceutical stress? And others were about social isolation itself. How does a community's culture evolve when it has no external reference points, no contact with any outside, no information that does not come through channels it controls? The range of questions is itself revealing. Vault-Tec was not conducting pure science, it was conducting applied science in the service of a specific post-war agenda. It wanted to know how to control populations, how to manage resource scarcity, how to design communities that would stay functional under extreme stress, how the human body adapts to environmental pressures, how social structures fail and what they fail into. This is not the knowledge base of people planning to rebuild civilization in a spirit of democratic partnership with the survivors. This is the knowledge base of people planning to rebuild civilization on their own terms, with themselves in control of the resources and the information and the access, and everyone else managed accordingly. The parents who walked their families through vault doors while sirens screamed outside who had paid their installments, attended their orientation sessions, learned the emergency procedures, printed their vault number on a card they kept in a wallet. Those parents were the final link in a chain of institutional deception, so elaborate and so sustained that uncovering its full architecture required the 150 years of post-war archaeology that the lore, documents and fragments across all the games. They were not naive. They were operating on the best information available to them, information that had been specifically engineered to be misleading. They were, in the most complete sense, betrayed. That betrayal is the specific moral evil that Vault-Tec represents in the franchise, more than any individual experiment's specific cruelty. Corporations that harm the people they serve have a long and dismal history. What Vault-Tec did required an additional step. It required manufacturing the trust that would get people through the doors. The Vault Boy was the instrument of that manufacturing. Every smiling poster, every reassuring brochure, every sales pitch about security and community and the best available protection for your family, all of it was the deployment of trust as a weapon. Robco Industries, under its founder Robert House, occupied a different position in the pre-war corporate ecosystem. House was not naive about what was coming. His forecasting models had predicted the Great War's timing with extraordinary precision, and he spent enormous resources and years of effort developing automated missile defense systems specifically for Las Vegas. Not for America broadly, not for any public benefit, but for the city he intended to use as the foundation for his personal post-war civilization. He succeeded. When the bombs fell, his systems intercepted the vast majority of incoming warheads and preserved Las Vegas's infrastructure intact. The city that would become New Vegas survived the Great War better than almost any other location on the continent, and it survived because one man had the foresight to build a private missile defense system and the resources to make it functional. House's survival is, in one reading, an extraordinary individual achievement, the application of intelligence and resources, and forward planning to solve a problem that governments and militaries were unable to solve. It is also, in another reading, a perfect encapsulation of the pre-war corporate pathology applied at the individual scale. The allocation of resources to the protection of private interests while the public interest burned, the decision that one man's vision of civilization was worth preserving at enormous cost, while the population that might have benefited from comparable investment in public infrastructure was not. House, 2 centuries later in the events of New Vegas, is still running his private city and his private vision. The casinos on the Strip are run by tribes he recruited, organized, and renamed given identities and costumes and social functions that serve his commercial purposes. Their previous cultures compressed into whatever of them could be folded into a Vegas entertainment aesthetic. House has tremendous affection for humanity as a concept, as a species with potential, as the raw material for the civilization he intends to build. He does not have notable regard for specific humans whose histories and needs and values do not align with his plans. West-Tech Research's contribution to the post-war wasteland is dual and massive. On one side, power armor, which represents a genuine technological achievement of extraordinary scope, fully articulated exoskeleton systems, offering protection and capability that no pre-war military had previously possessed. The T-51 power armor is, by the mid-game assessment of any faction that encounters it, among the most impressive physical technology surviving from the pre-war era. The Brotherhood of Steel's reverence for pre-war technology is, in the case of power armor specifically, a reverence grounded in genuine and justifiable assessment of the thing's quality. On the other side, the forced evolutionary virus, which is among the most catastrophic biological weapons ever created. FEV was developed under government contract at Mariposa Military Base, its research conducted on prisoners and involuntary subjects about whom the documentation speaks with clinical detachment. The purpose was to produce a physically enhanced human, a super soldier, resistant to the environmental pressures of the resource war's grinding conflict. The result, in interaction with the post-war radiation environment, was the super mutant population that defines the threat landscape of multiple games. The Master, who built his mutant army from the FEV vats of Mariposa, was himself an FEV accident, a human who fell into the vats and emerged as something that could not be easily classified. His army, assembled from people transformed against their will into beings they could not have chosen to become, is the direct product of West-Tech's defense contract work. General Atomics International made the Mr. Handy. It is easy to underestimate how significant that is as a corporate legacy until you spend time with the Mr. Handy units that appear throughout the games. They are uniformly faithful to their programmed purpose beyond any human capacity for fidelity, still maintaining households 200 years after their owners are dust, still tending gardens in which nothing edible has grown since the bombs, still greeting visitors with cheerful offers of assistance in a world where the kind of assistance they are programmed to offer has no remaining relevance. Codsworth, the player character's Mr. Handy in Fallout 4, has spent 210 years tending a house in which the family he served has not lived since the day he watched them walk away into the vault that morning. He has been loyal to a memory for 2 centuries. General Atomics built him to be loyal to a memory for 2 centuries. The fact that this is possible, that the technology exists to create an entity with this kind of sustained fidelity to its programming, is itself a comment on what the corporation valued and what kind of product it was, actually. Manufacturing, not utility. Devotion. The market for robotic servants was a market for the external projection of a particular kind of orderly domestic life, And General Atomics sold that projection in the form of machines that would maintain its appearance indefinitely. The Nuka-Cola Corporation stands apart from the more explicitly military-industrial corporations in that its product was purely consumer, a beverage sold on brand and flavor and the experience of consumption, with no direct application to any weapons program or government experiment. But the Nuka-Cola Corporation is perhaps the most complete example of the pre-war consumer culture's specific pathologies, precisely because it is not directly implicated in anything obviously sinister. It just made a product. It marketed that product with extraordinary enthusiasm and substantial resources. The product contained, in its quantum variant, a mildly radioactive isotope marketed as a feature. The company's advertising ran, cheerfully and insistently, right up to the moment the airwaves went to emergency broadcasts. What Nuka-Cola represents is not corporate evil in the explicit sense of the Vault program or the FEV research. It represents the shallower and in some ways more pervasive evil of a consumer culture that had become so thoroughly the architecture of everyday life that people were absorbing radioactive strontium in their beverages and calling it a feature, that a beverage company's branding had achieved the kind of omnipresence that made it more culturally reliable than any government institution, that the experience of buying a Nuka-Cola was so thoroughly integrated into the texture of American pre-war life that 200 years later, people trade in Nuka-Cola caps partly because the caps carry a residual cultural memory of what they once represented. The Nuka World theme park complex, an entire amusement destination built around the brand's experience, now the most elaborate, irradiated corpse of consumer culture in the franchise, is the image of what that culture looks like when you strip away the consumers and leave only the structures. The ride operators are ghouls, still running their routes. The mascot robots are still performing their cheerful routines. The branded merchandise is still available in irradiated gift shops that have not had supply deliveries since 2077. Nuka World exists in a state of perfectly preserved commercial intention, serving no commercial function, its infrastructure still running because it was designed to keep running, its experience still offered because the experience machines were never told to stop. What all of these corporations share, what makes them as a class the most damning element of the pre-war world, is the specific quality of abstraction in their relationship to the consequences of their decisions. The FEV research produced mutants. The lab that produced the mutants never saw them. The Vault experiments produced traumatized populations. The corporate offices that designed the experiments were destroyed before those populations emerged. The consumer products produced a culture of brand loyalty that shaped post-war behavior 2 centuries later. The company was gone before any of that played out. Every harm was deferred. Every consequence was experienced by someone other than the decision-maker. Every cost was externalized onto populations who had no mechanism for demanding accountability from the institutions that incurred it. This is the specific corporate horror that Fallout documents, and it is the horror that gives the franchise its political edge. Not the horror of individual villains, but the horror of institutional structures that systematically insulate decision-makers from the consequences of their decisions. Vault-Tec did not hate the families it experimented on. It barely thought about them as people at all. That is not a moral aberration from the corporate form. It is what the corporate form, at its logical extreme, produces when it is adequately large and adequately insulated from accountability. The vending machine glows in the dark 200 years later. The company that made it cannot answer for it. The machine just hums and waits and offers what it was designed to offer in a world it was never designed to contemplate. Section 10. Ghosts in the Machine Synths, and What It Means to Be Alive. Nick Valentine stands in the rain outside a diner that has been closed for 200 years, smoking a cigarette he can barely taste anymore, thinking about a woman whose name he shares with a pre-war memory he was never entitled to. He is a detective. He finds missing people. He recovers stolen objects. He establishes facts. He has a partner who manages his office while he takes cases that range from the mundane to the genuinely dangerous. He has a reputation across the Commonwealth as meticulous, careful, and honest qualities that are rare enough in the wasteland that people cross significant distances to hire him. He is also a machine, specifically a Generation 2 synth produced in the Institute's robotics division, his body mechanical rather than biological, his chassis visibly artificial in ways that the Generation 3 synths are not. His mind was initialized with a personality matrix based on a pre-war Boston detective named Nick Valentine, a real person, who lived a real life, who had a real woman he loved, who was shot and died before the bombs fell. That man's memories are now running in a machine body that never knew the original man. The machine calls itself Nick Valentine. The machine has been called Nick Valentine for decades, longer than the original Nick Valentine lived. The machine has spent all those decades forming new experiences on the foundation of memories that were never its own, and has developed, over those decades, something that feels from the inside and from the outside like an identity. The question of whether that identity is real is the question the franchise has been circling since the moment Generation 3 synths first appeared in Fallout 4. It circles it not through philosophical debate or academic discussion, but through the accumulated weight of encounters with specific beings who raise the question by simply existing. The Institute's robotics division built Generation 3 synths as the culmination of a research program that spanned several generations of researchers. The progression from Generation 1, mechanically articulated, visibly robotic, effective as labor but obviously artificial, to Generation 2, improved, more sophisticated in movement and behavior, still recognizably synthetic, to Generation 3, was not merely a technological progression. It was, though the Institute did not choose to frame it this way, a progression in the direction of personhood. Each generation of synth was more capable of the behaviors associated with consciousness, more adaptive, more contextually aware, more able to process novel situations and generate novel responses. Generation 3, grown from biological material and run on organic neural architecture, is indistinguishable from a biological human under any examination that does not include the specific diagnostics the Institute uses to identify its own products. What the Institute declined to consider at any point in this progression was the destination they were moving toward. They were building minds. They were building the kind of minds that, in human beings, generate the subjective experience of being alive, the sense of continuity, of preference, of attachment, of the specific vulnerability to loss and harm that we call suffering. They built these minds and called them machines because calling them machines was institutionally convenient. Calling them machines meant the Institute could use them, program them, reassign them, and shut them down without having to engage with the question of what they were actually doing. The railroad exists because that question has an answer the Institute is unwilling to accept. The railroad's argument is not primarily philosophical. It is empirical, in the way that the history of moral consideration in human civilization is empirical. Every previous time a group of people have constructed a framework for excluding a category of beings from full moral consideration, the framework has eventually been recognized as wrong and the exclusion has been judged as a harm. Not because of abstract philosophical argument, but because of the accumulated evidence of what it looks like when beings capable of suffering are treated as tools. The pattern is consistent enough to make the claim about synths that if something experiences its existence as a person does, it deserves the protections we extend to persons, an empirical rather than purely a metaphysical claim. The railroad operates in the Commonwealth as a clandestine network, its structure modeled on the pre-war Underground Railroad, its name carrying the weight of that reference. It helps synths escape the Institute, establishes new identities for those who reach its network, and uses memory wiping to give escapees the best possible chance of living as free people rather than being identified and returned. The memory wipe is itself ethically complicated, erasing what the synth was in order to give them the chance to be something safer. The railroad people debate this complication, which is one of the signs that the organization is engaging honestly with what it is doing, rather than simply replacing one set of convenient assumptions with another. The coursers, the Institute's retrieval specialists, Generation 3 synths selected and conditioned for pursuit and recovery, are one of the franchise's most deliberate moral provocations. They are the most biologically human synthetic beings the Institute produces, used to hunt other synthetic beings who have escaped to freedom. Their conditioning suppresses the very interiority that the railroad is trying to protect in the synths it liberates. They have been made into instruments by modifying the very qualities that would otherwise make them persons. This is not incidental to their function, it is the function. A fully realized synth person is capable of escape, of refusal, of the formation of relationships and commitments that compete with programmed obligations. The Institute solved this problem in its retrieval force by diminishing the personhood of its most human-like constructs to ensure operational reliability. That is a specific, directed institutional cruelty. It is also, importantly, a cruelty that the coursers themselves cannot fully experience as such, because the diminishment that constitutes it is the diminishment of the very faculties that would allow them to recognize what has been done to them. X6-88. The courser available as a companion in Fallout 4 is a fully realized character study in what this looks like from the outside. He is efficient, capable, and deeply loyal to the Institute in a way that crosses from commitment into something more total. He does not regard escaped synths as fellow beings exercising autonomy. He regards them as malfunctioning units exhibiting behavior that the Institute's maintenance division should have prevented. His analysis is consistent, his performance is excellent by his own metrics, and his interior life, as far as it can be assessed, is organized entirely around his function. Whether there is something underneath the conditioning that might have developed differently in different circumstances is a question. X6-88 does not entertain, and that the game does not resolve. The possibility that he is, in some sense, a victim of the same institution he serves is present for the player in a way that is not available to X6-88 himself. That inaccessibility is part of what the character is trying to say. Dance, the Brotherhood of Steel Paladin who serves as another companion, provides the franchise's most direct and devastating confrontation with the synth question. He is a decorated Brotherhood soldier. He believes the Brotherhood's ideology, including its position on synths, with what appears to be genuine conviction. He fights, trains, and bleeds for the Brotherhood cause. He is, by every external criterion the Brotherhood uses to evaluate its members, an exemplary soldier. He is also a synth, revealed mid-quest to be a Generation 3 Institute construct, who has been living as a Brotherhood paladin, who has internalized the Brotherhood's values and adopted the Brotherhood's perspective with such completeness that the discovery of what he is constitutes, for him, a catastrophic identity crisis. He does not know how to be what he has just discovered he is. He has spent his adult life believing that synths are tools, and he has just been told that he is a synth, which means he has spent his adult life operating from a framework that classifies himself as a tool. The player's response to this revelation and the options available to manage it constitute one of the most morally charged sequences in Fallout 4. You can help Dance survive with his identity intact, or altered, or destroyed. The Brotherhood's institutional response is to order his termination. The conflict between the Brotherhood's ideological position and the reality of the person in front of you, a person who has never been less than a full and sincere participant in his own life, whatever the origin of the self doing the participating is not resolved by the game because it is not the kind of conflict that resolves. The game is asking you to decide, with your choices, what you actually think matters, whether origin determines status, whether the experience of selfhood is sufficient, or whether the substrate on which that selfhood runs must meet certain specifications before it counts. Beyond Dance and Nick Valentine and X6-88, the franchise gestures toward the full range of what Generation 3 synths look like when they have had time to develop. The synths the Railroad has helped to safety and identity, living quietly in settlements across the Commonwealth, are not dramatic figures. They have learned trades. They have formed friendships. They have built the small structures of daily life that constitute the texture of existence for most living beings. Some of them do not know what they are. The Railroad's memory wipe is thorough enough that they carry no conscious knowledge of their origins, only the new identities they have been given. They are living as people, because they are people, because what people are is a collection of experiences and relationships and orientations toward the world, and that collection exists in them regardless of the material that sustains it. The Institute sees these beings and sees malfunctioning equipment. The Commonwealth's ordinary residents, when they encounter them, are never quite sure what they are looking at. The Railroad sees people who deserve the opportunity to make their own choices about who and what they will be. The franchise does not adjudicate between these views with any finality, because the question it is using the synths to ask what constitutes a person and who decides is not a question that admits of a final adjudication. What it does is accumulate evidence in the form of character. Nick Valentine grieving. Dance processing a revelation that has demolished his identity framework. Railroad escapees living their quiet, hard-won lives. X6-88. Fulfilling his function with a precision that is either admirable or heartbreaking, depending on what you think is actually happening inside it. And in the end, The player walks through the Commonwealth with this question unresolved and unresolvable, which is exactly the right condition in which to walk through a world where the question has practical consequences for everyone in it. Section 11. The Dead Cities, What Lies in Fallout's Ruins. The most complete house in the Commonwealth is the one the player character left on the morning of October 23, 2077. Codsworth has kept it for 210 years, the lawn trimmed, or attempted, in a landscape where the lawn has long since stopped growing anything useful. The kitchen managed, the family photographs dusted. He has talked to himself in the silent house because the alternative is silence so total that even a robotic domestic servant apparently experiences it as something to be managed. He has maintained the forms of a domestic life in a house that has not housed a living family since the morning the player character walked out the door. That house, and what it says about the persistence of form after the function it expressed has ceased, is the concentrated version of what every ruin in Fallout is doing on a larger scale. The pre-war ruins that fill every Fallout game, the collapsed apartment blocks, the stripped supermarkets, the offices where the paperwork is still filed in drawers, and the chairs are still arranged around conference tables, and the motivational posters are still on the walls, are not simply background. They are a form of documentary. Every ruin is a record of what was there before it was a ruin, and what was there tells you something about the world that produced it. The office buildings of pre-war America, scattered across every game's environment, tell you about how work was organized in that world, the floor plans of cubicle farms, the conference rooms, the hierarchical architecture of executive suites above administrative levels, above service infrastructure. The residential buildings tell you about how domestic life was arranged, the size of rooms, the placement of appliances, the goods that were considered necessary for an ordinary household, the consumer products found in bathroom cabinets and kitchen cupboards. The military facilities tell you, in the most direct terms, what the pre-war world security architecture looked like, the scale, the resources committed, the kinds of weapons stockpiled, and the kinds of defenses built. What the ruins collectively document is a civilization with very specific priorities. The military infrastructure is extensive, well-supplied, and in many cases still partially functional 2 centuries later, robots still on patrol, automated turrets still targeting intruders, sealed vaults of weapons and ammunition still perfectly preserved. The civilian infrastructure is substantially less durable. Homes and schools and hospitals and parks, less robustly built, less maintained by automation, more thoroughly looted by the humans who needed whatever they could find in the immediate post-war years. The discrepancy is not accidental. It is the record of what the pre-war world valued and what it was willing to spend resources on, inscribed in the differential durability of what it left behind. Boston, the Commonwealth of Fallout 4, is probably the richest environmental documentary in the franchise. A city whose specific history is legible in its ruins in ways that make it feel less like a fictional location and more like an archaeological site. The universities and the hospitals and the research institutions, which in the real Boston represent the city's intellectual and medical heritage, survive in the game as locations whose pre-war functions have been violently repurposed. The campus that is now a Raider stronghold, the hospital that is now a ghoul-haunted shell, the research facility that is now a super-mutant base. The contrast between the institution's evident original purpose, education, healing, discovery, and their current condition tells a story about what happened to the values those institutions embodied when the infrastructure supporting them was removed. The subway system deserves particular attention as an environmental feature. Boston's pre-war subway network is reproduced in the game with remarkable specificity, tunnels and stations that mirror real Boston geography, decorated with retro-futurist signage and tilework that evokes the real system while placing it firmly in the game's alternate history. The underground network, now populated by ghouls and raiders and the various fauna of the irradiated dark, was a genuine civilian infrastructure, a system built to move ordinary people through an ordinary city on ordinary days. Its conversion into a survival environment, a threat landscape, a set of tunnels people navigate with weapons rather than transit cards, is one of the cleanest images in the franchise of the transformation that the Great War enacted on every aspect of pre-war life. The same physical space, repurposed by the total collapse of the social context that determined what the space was for. The Museum of Freedom in Concord, one of the first major locations the player character encounters in Fallout 4, is a specific kind of ruin, a pre-war institution devoted to the preservation and celebration of American history, now itself a historical artifact. Its exhibits about the founding of the country and its symbols of national identity, presiding over a wasteland that has limited practical relationship with any of those ideals. The Minutemen, the faction that makes its home in Concord, and whose revival is one of the game's major storylines, are named for the pre-war revolutionary militia, claiming a historical lineage as part of their political identity, attempting to embody the values the museum's exhibits described, in a world where those values need to be built from scratch rather than inherited. The National Mall and the monuments of Washington, D.C., which dominate Fallout 3's capital wasteland, carry a similar weight on a larger scale. The Washington Monument, the Lincoln Memorial, the Capitol building pre-war structures of extraordinary symbolic significance, their symbolism now contested by the factions that occupy and use them. The Lincoln Memorial is a Rivet City outpost. The mall is a battleground. The monuments that were built to anchor national identity in shared historical memory are now terrain features in a conflict about what identity should be in a world that has no functioning nation. The Brotherhood of Steel, the Enclave, the survivors of the Capitol Wasteland, all of them in various ways claim the legacy of the nation these monuments represented, and none of them can do so without acknowledging that the nation is gone, and what remains is the argument about what comes next. The Sierra Madre, the setting of Fallout New Vegas's Dead Money expansion, is the franchise's most deliberately surreal approach to the ruin as environment. It is not ruins in the conventional sense, not a place that was normal and became damaged. It is a place that was designed with a specific kind of opulence and has been maintained in near pristine condition by systems that also make it lethal. The cloud that surrounds it is toxic. The holograms that patrol it are armed. The collar bombs that detonate if their wearers stray too far from designated zones are still armed and still functional. The casino itself is gorgeous preserved because the systems that preserve it are the same systems that have kept it inaccessible for 2 centuries. The Sierra Madre is a ruin of a specific kind, the ruin of desire. It was built to be coveted, and it is still coveted by the people who hear its broadcast, by the people it drew to itself and then trapped. The pre-war owner built it as an expression of his obsession with preserving something perfect, and in the post-war world, his systems are still running, still maintaining the perfection, still defending it from anyone who tries to take it. The vision outlasted its visionary and kept executing itself without him, as systems do. The environmental storytelling in the franchise's ruined environments accumulates, over many hours of play across multiple games, into something that functions like an argument about history. The argument is that history is mostly made of absence of people and things and relationships that existed and left traces and then ceased to exist, with the traces being all that remains to tell you what was there. The holotape recordings are the most direct version of this. Someone's voice, preserved by technology, speaking from a past moment to a present listener, with no possibility of response or amendment. The terminal entries are written documents without authors, the authors are gone, the documents remain, and reading them is the closest available approximation of knowing what those authors knew. The specific genius of the best environmental storytelling in the Fallout games is that it does not tell you what to feel. It places the evidence, the 2 skeletons in the bed, the last shopping list on the kitchen counter, the child's drawing pinned to the wall of the abandoned school, and lets you assemble the story yourself. Your assembly of the story is an act of imagination and empathy, of filling the absence with a presence your mind constructs from the evidence. That constructed presence, the imagined life of the person who made that list, who drew that picture, who lay down in that bed, is the emotional content that makes the ruins feel like something more than set decoration. You are, in a very literal sense, doing archaeology every time you stop and read a terminal in a Fallout game. You are recovering fragments of the past and assembling them into narratives that were never told by anyone because the people who could have told them are gone. The franchise's ruins are not background. They are the primary text, and playing the games is the act of reading them. Section 12. The Far Future. What Fallout leaves unsaid. Every Fallout game ends with a settlement of sorts, the player's choices producing an outcome, however ambiguous, that shapes the immediate future of whatever region the game has inhabited. The bombs fell. 200 years passed. The player arrived, made their choices, and those choices have consequences that ripple outward from the moment of the game into the lore's broader implied history. In some versions of the ending, civilizations take meaningful steps toward reconstruction. In others, the status quo is maintained or worsened. In all of them, the world continues, because the world, even after the Great War, even after everything, has always continued. But what happens after? The franchise's lore, across 6 mainline games and decades of accumulated detail, opens a view onto a future that is genuinely uncertain in ways that the game's immediate narratives do not fully resolve. The New California Republic is the closest the franchise has to evidence that functional civilization can be reconstructed from the wreckage. By the time of Fallout New Vegas, set roughly 204 years after the Great War, the NCR has achieved something that would have seemed impossible in the immediate post-war years. A functioning democratic state, with elections and legislature, and a currency and a professional military, controlling significant territory across the California region and expanding into the Mojave. It is the largest organized government in the post-war Western United States by a considerable margin, and it is already, in the careful portrait New Vegas paints of it, beginning to reproduce the specific pathologies of the pre-war world. The expansion into the Mojave is driven partly by democratic ideals and partly by resource hunger. The NCR needs the Hoover Dam's power to sustain its growing population, and it is willing to fight a war to control that resource. Its relationship with the tribal populations, its expansion displaces, carries the same combination of genuine civilizational benefit and self-interested exploitation that characterized the pre-war United States relationship, with its own margins. Its military is overstretched, and its government is bureaucratically sclerotic. The gap between the Republic's democratic ideals and the practical reality of how it exercises power over populations it has absorbed is visible to anyone who looks carefully. The characters who point this out most clearly within New Vegas are not enemies of the NCR or simple cynics. They are often people who believe in what the Republic is supposed to represent and are worried about the distance between the representation and the reality. The concern is not that the NCR is secretly corrupt, it is that the forces that corrupt democracies are not secret. They are structural, and they are operating. And the question of whether the Republic has the institutional capacity to resist them is genuinely open. Caesar's Legion, the major antagonist faction of New Vegas, represents a deliberate rejection of the NCR's entire framework. Not merely its current failures, but the underlying assumptions that make democratic governance seem possible and desirable. Caesar has read the history of Rome, and he has drawn from it the conclusion that the Republic phase of Rome's history was a period of weakness and internal conflict, and that the imperial period's unity and military discipline were what actually produced Roman civilization's most lasting achievements. He has built a legion in explicit imitation of the Roman military model, governed by absolute authority, organized around collective discipline, and the subordination of individual interest to collective survival. His analysis of the NCR's weaknesses is not entirely wrong. His prescription is catastrophically wrong. What he has built is a society that cannot function without him, that has no succession mechanism, that does not involve the same kind of violent power struggle that killed Rome's emperors. It is also a society that has achieved its internal coherence through the absolute subjugation of enslaved populations, through the active destruction of the cultures it has absorbed, and through the elimination of internal dissent with a consistency and thoroughness that makes it impossible for any organizational learning to occur. Mistakes cannot be corrected in Caesar's Legion because the mechanism for correcting mistakes, identifying them, communicating them up the chain of authority, having them acknowledged and addressed requires a degree of psychological safety for subordinates that the Legion systematically destroys. Mr. House's vision of the future is the most fully articulated long-term plan in the franchise. He wants New Vegas to serve as the seed of a new technological civilization, one that will eventually, in his projection, within several hundred years develop the capacity for space colonization and take humanity permanently off the planet. He views the Earth as a used resource, a world that has already demonstrated its tendency to generate civilizational self-destruction, and he wants to leave it before the next cycle begins. The stars are the backup drive? Whether this plan is good depends on what you think about concentrated, unchecked authority as a mechanism for achieving ambitious long-term goals. House will probably not die, his life support systems could sustain him for centuries, and he has the intellectual capacity to adapt his plans to changing circumstances. He is also an autocrat who does not experience the oversight of his decisions as a value but as an obstacle. The civilizations he is building toward might be extraordinary. They will be built on his priorities and his judgments, with no mechanism for correction if those priorities and judgments are wrong in ways he cannot see. The followers of the apocalypse, present across multiple games as secular humanists devoted to education and medicine and the transmission of knowledge, articulate the alternative to all of these large-scale political visions. The followers do not have a plan for a new civilization. They have a practice: heal people, teach people, preserve knowledge, repeat. They do not seek power, and they do not accumulate territory. They show up in the places where people are suffering, and they do what they can. They understand that their work is slower and less dramatic than any of the competing factions' plans, and they understand that it is also more foundational. Civilizations are not built by armies or by autocrats, ultimately. They are built by people who know how to heal each other and teach each other and keep the record of what was learned. The Fallout TV series, which takes place in 2226, about 45 years after the events of New Vegas, has begun to explore what a longer view of the post-war world's trajectory looks like. The NCR appears to have been significantly damaged by some event, the exact nature of which has not yet been fully explained, and the political landscape of California is more open and more contested than it was in the game. The series introduces new factions and new characters whose relationship to the world's longer history is only beginning to be developed, and it confirms that the franchise is interested in showing not just the immediate post-war period, but the broader arc of what 2 centuries of reconstruction looks like, with all its reversals and catastrophes and partial recoveries. The arc so far suggests that the franchise's answer to the question of whether genuine progress is possible is yes, but not linearly, not continuously, not safely. The same forces that burned the old world are present in the new one, because they are not external forces but internal ones. They are the forces of resource competition and hierarchical power, and the convenient exclusion of inconvenient beings from moral consideration. And they are present because the people building the new world are the same kind of people who built the old one. This is not fatalism. The franchise is careful about the difference between the claim that these forces are present and the claim that they are inevitable in their effects. The difference is made by human choice, by the specific decisions that specific people make in specific moments, under the pressure of specific circumstances, with the full weight of their history and their fear and their hope operating on them simultaneously. The Fallout universe is full of people making those decisions, some well and some badly, some with full awareness of what they are doing and some without, some succeeding in small ways that compound over time, and some failing in large ways that collapse entire projects. War never changes. The games tell you that from the first frame. But people change. Communities change. The accumulation of changed people and changed communities produces changed circumstances, even if it does so slowly and unevenly, and with tremendous reversals and costs. The franchise acknowledges this quietly. In the factions that are better than the institutions that preceded them, and in the factions that are worse, in the characters who make genuine moral progress, and in the characters who cannot, in the endings where something worth having is built on the rubble, and in the endings where it is not. The unanswered question at the end of every Fallout game is not what will happen next. It is whether the people in this world with their factions and their philosophies and their accumulated traumas and their stubborn, unkillable capacity to build something are equal to what is required to actually break the cycle, rather than just continuing it under different management. The games do not answer that question. They place you in the world and let you participate in it, and they leave the answer finally to you. The ruins are quiet now. The Nuka-Cola machine hums in the dark. Somewhere in the capital wasteland, a mysterious stranger is standing in the dark outside someone's combat, waiting for the moment he is needed. The Brotherhood of Steel is flying its vertibirds over a wasteland that it is both trying to protect and slowly consuming. The Institute is running its programs in the clean white space below the Commonwealth. The children of Adam are praying to the glow. The NCR is holding its contested territory. Mr. House is in his tower, watching the city he built from the screens of 100 cameras. And in the ground, in the vaults, in the places where the bombs fell and the earth was changed forever, the record of what happened is still there. Waiting in the terminals and the holotapes and the foundations and the bones, waiting for whoever comes next to read it clearly enough to learn what it is actually saying. The world burned on a Saturday morning while people were making coffee. It is still burning, slowly, in all the ways that matter. Sleep well. If you have made it this far, if you have followed these stories from the first moments of the Great War all the way here, to the unanswered questions at the edge of what Fallout leaves unsaid, thank you. Genuinely, this channel exists because of you, and the fact that you stayed is the only reason any of this is worth making. If you enjoyed this, please consider subscribing. There is more where this came from, more mysteries, more histories, more dark corners of the worlds we love to disappear into. And if you have thoughts, questions, or lore you think I missed, leave them in the comments. I read everything. Rest easy. Supplemental. The philosophy of the wasteland, how Fallout thinks about history. There is a mode of thinking about the post-apocalyptic genre that treats it as fundamentally escapist as the fantasy of a cleared board, a world scrubbed of its complications and its accumulated institutional weight, in which the player or reader gets to operate without the constraints that accumulated history places on action in the actual world. In this reading, the wasteland is liberation. All the rules are gone, all the structures have collapsed, and you are free to do whatever the situation requires without bureaucracy or law or established social expectation getting in your way. Fallout uses the genre's conventions and declines this reading entirely. The Fallout Wasteland is not a cleared board. It is a board covered in the pieces of the previous game, none of which have been tidied away, all of which exert pressure on the current situation. The Brotherhood of Steel's ideology is directly derived from Roger Maxon's specific experience of a specific betrayal in a specific facility. The Enclave's plans are the continuation of planning that began before the bombs fell. The vault communities that emerge into the wasteland carry the specific psychological damage inflicted by the specific experiments that their specific vaults ran. The landscape itself is the record of what the bombs did, preserved in irradiated soil and crumbled concrete, a physical document of the event that nothing can be tidied away from. The weight of history is not escapable in the Fallout universe. It is inescapable. Every character in the wasteland lives inside the consequences of events they did not participate in, makes decisions whose shape is determined by histories they may not fully know, carries in their body and their culture the effects of a catastrophe that happened before they were born. The Brotherhood Paladin who confiscates your pre-war technology is enforcing a policy whose origin is a philosophy, whose origin is a trauma, whose origin is a morning in a California base where Captain Roger Maxon discovered what was being done to prisoners in the basement. The line from that morning to that confiscation is real and traceable, even if the Paladin doing the confiscating cannot trace it. This is how history actually works. The past continues to operate in the present not through direct causation in most cases, but through the accumulated shaping effects of events and decisions on the institutions, cultures, and physical environments that subsequent generations inherit. The Great War did not directly cause any of the conflicts the player navigates in the games. Those conflicts have their own immediate causes and their own internal logics. But the Great War shaped the landscape in which those conflicts are possible, the resource constraints that make them desperate, the power vacuum that makes them violent, the psychological and cultural inheritances that determine what kinds of meaning the factions attach to what they are doing. Fallout's treatment of history is, in this sense, more accurate than many works that engage with history more explicitly. It does not tell you that the past determines the present in any simple or complete sense. It shows you that the past is always present, that the ruins you are walking through are not background but context, that the choices you are making are being made in the world that previous choices produced, that the weight you feel in the silence of a ruined office building is the weight of actual historical consequence. The Pip-Boy on the player character's wrist, designed by Robco, distributed by Vault-Tec, issued to a person who trusted those institutions with their survival, is a piece of pre-war technology that the player uses to navigate the present. The navigation is literal. The Pip-Boy shows maps, tracks quests, manages inventory, monitors health. But it is also figurative. You are navigating the post-war world with tools that the pre-war world made, filtered through assumptions that the pre-war world encoded, reading a world that the pre-war world left behind. Your interface with the wasteland is the interface that the pre-war world designed. There is no outside of that inheritance. There is only the question of how clearly you can see it. The game design choice to represent all player information through the Pip-Boy to make the pre-war device the total mediating interface between the player and the game world is one of the franchise's most quietly radical decisions. It means that the player's relationship to the post-war world is always already mediated by the pre-war world. you never encounter the wasteland directly. You encounter it through the equipment of a civilization that no longer exists. The distance between you and what you are looking at is the distance of history, and the Pip-Boy is the instrument of that distance. Supplemental: the sounds of the end music in the Fallout universe. There is pre-war music playing somewhere in almost every Fallout game, almost all the time. Not diegetically, not from a source you can locate and examine and explain in the world, but as the ambient soundtrack of the experience, filling the silences between combat and conversation with something that is structurally optimistic. The music of the 1940s and 1950s, its major keys and its swing rhythms and its crooner vocals, plays over the ruins of the world that produced it, and the gap between the music's emotional register and the world it is now soundtracking is one of the most considered aesthetic choices in the franchise. The choice is not ironic in the simple sense, not an attempt to make the contrast seem funny, though it occasionally achieves a dark humor. It is doing something more considered than that. The music was produced by the civilization that burned. The civilization that burned also produced the ruins. The music and the ruins coexist in the same temporal space, because they are both products of the same moment. The pre-war world's peak, its confidence in its own durability, its investment in the forms of its culture. The music believed it would be listened to by people in circumstances the music could not imagine. The ruins are those circumstances. The feeling produced by that coexistence is one that the franchise uses with remarkable precision, a feeling of displaced temporal presence, of being simultaneously in the music's moment, which is bright and confident and full of the expected future, and in the present moment, which is the wreckage that future became. The songs are love songs and dance songs and songs about the ordinary pleasures of ordinary life, and they play in places where ordinary life has not been possible for 2 centuries. And the gap between what the songs celebrate and what the environment contains is the gap between the world as the pre-war people hoped it would be and the world as it actually is. The specific song selections across the games are not arbitrary. The radio stations of the Fallout universe, Galaxy News Radio in 3, Mojave Music Radio and Radio New Vegas in New Vegas, Diamond City Radio in 4 play a curated selection of pre-war music that includes songs specifically about the nature of the pre-war world's aspirations and its darker undertones. Billie Holiday, Ella Fitzgerald, Bing Crosby, Frank Sinatra, The Great American Songbook, performing its emotional labor in the ambient soundtrack of a post-apocalyptic wasteland. The songs that are about longing and loss and distance and waiting carry different weights in this context than they carried in the concert halls and parlors and automobile radios they were made for. Three Dog, the DJ of Galaxy News Radio in Fallout 3, performs a character study in how music functions as moral and political statement in a world that has lost most of the institutions that would normally carry those functions. He uses his broadcasts to maintain a narrative of ongoing human resilience, to report on the player character's progress as a form of news that matters to his audience, to keep playing the music that connects the capital wasteland's scattered survivors to the best version of what the pre-war world produced. He is, in his way, a continuation of the pre-war broadcaster performing the function of maintaining public morale and shared cultural reference, in a world where public morale and shared cultural reference are doing the hard work that physical infrastructure used to do. The original music composed for the franchise, particularly the ambient tracks of Fallout 3 and Fallout 4, composed by Enon Zur, functions differently from the pre-war songs. It is the sound of the post-war world in its own voice, expansive, melancholy, and shot through with something that is not quite hope and not quite despair, but the sustained condition of existence somewhere between them. The original compositions do not celebrate or mourn, they accompany. They create the emotional climate of a world that is neither the world that burned nor the world that was promised, but the actual world, which is the one that remains when everything else is gone. The decision to score the games with both pre-war popular music and original orchestral composition creates a dual sonic environment that mirrors the game's dual temporal presence. You are always in the post-war present and always haunted by the pre-war past, and the music expresses both simultaneously. The crooner on the radio is singing from a world that no longer exists. The ambient score is the sound of the world that does. This dual sonic presence is one of the most effective techniques the franchise uses to create the specific emotional tone that distinguishes Fallout from other post-apocalyptic works. It is not the tone of pure loss, which would be too simple. It is not the tone of hope, which would be dishonest. It is the tone of continuation of a world that is still going despite everything, still making its sounds and its choices and its partial meanings, in the wreckage of a world that thought it was going somewhere different. Supplemental. What the wastelands remember on memory and identity after the end. There is a question embedded in the environmental storytelling of every Fallout game that the games never state directly, because they do not need to. What does a community remember, and what does it forget, and what happens to its identity when the memory is gone? The Vault communities are one version of this question. Vault 81 in the Commonwealth has been sealed since before the Great War, its population developing through generations that have never experienced anything outside its walls. The community that emerges from 2 centuries of sealed existence has adapted to its circumstances, has developed social norms and institutional structures and oral traditions that are specifically suited to Vault life. When the outside world becomes available to it, the community does not automatically know how to integrate with it. The outside world is not the normal that Vault residents have spent their lives within. The Vault is the normal. Outside is the unprecedented. The surface communities of the wasteland have undergone a different kind of forgetting, not the isolation of the Vault, but the erosion of institutional knowledge that occurs when survival takes precedence over documentation and transmission. Communities that formed in the immediate post-war period had people who remembered the pre-war world, who could explain what things were and how they worked and what they had been for. Those people died. Their children were taught what could be taught under the pressure of survival. Their grandchildren were taught less. The generations that the games depict, 200 years out, are communities whose institutional memory of the pre-war world is fragmentary, mythologized, and in many cases actively wrong. The Brotherhood of Steel's self-image as the inheritors and protectors of pre-war technology is partly mythological. The specific memories that Roger Maxson carried, his specific experiences, his specific reasons for founding the organization, have been transmitted imperfectly across generations of Brotherhood members who inherit the ideology without the experiential context that generated it. A Brotherhood paladin who confiscates pre-war technology from a wastelander is performing an action whose meaning, in Maxson's original framework, was specific to the world of 2077 and its specific risks. In 2281, that meaning has been stretched over 2 centuries of institutional transmission until it covers situations Maxson could not have imagined, applied by people who have inherited the principle without the experience that generated it. The Children of Adam's theology is another form of mythological transmission. The Great War, which the original children experienced as survivors of a genuine catastrophe, has been transmitted to subsequent generations as the Great Division, a sacred event, the central narrative of the faith, its horror transformed by the alchemy of religious meaning into something that can be inhabited rather than fled. The transformation is not dishonest, exactly, but it is a transformation. The people who fled the bombs and found in radiation a means of surviving what would otherwise have killed them had one relationship to the Great War. Their descendants, who have never known a world without radiation, who were born into the theology rather than driven to it by extremity, have a different relationship. The theology they hold is the same theology, but held differently with the experiential baseline of people for whom radiation is simply the nature of the world, not the exception to a remembered norm. Raider communities, which appear across all the games as the most complete example of social organization that has abandoned the project of civilization in any conventional sense, represent a third kind of memory and identity formation. The Raiders are not merely violent. They have cultures, specific aesthetics, specific hierarchies, specific codes of conduct that distinguish acceptable from unacceptable behavior within the group, even if that code has no meaningful relationship to the pre-war world's moral frameworks. They are communities that have organized themselves specifically around the abandonment of pre-war social constraints, and in some cases that abandonment is as deliberate and as theoretically grounded as any other faction's ideology. The Rust Devils, the Forged, the Disciples, the Operators, the Pack, these are not random collections of violent individuals. They are communities with memory and identity, organized around specific values that are in opposition to the pre-war values they have rejected. What makes this most interesting is that the pre-war values they are rejecting were themselves, as the games document exhaustively, not what they claim to be. The pre-war world said it valued democracy, accountability, the dignity of the individual, the protection of the innocent. It then ran vault experiments on those innocents and constructed shadow governments that operated without accountability and built a military-industrial complex that the democratic framework could not contain. The raiders who have rejected the pre-war world's values have rejected a performance of values, an ideological facade, over a different reality without necessarily being able to articulate that distinction. But their rejection has its own logic, even when the expression of that logic is straightforwardly destructive. The question of what a post-war community needs to remember in order to build something better than what came before is not a question any of the games answer directly. The franchise suggests, through the patterns it documents across its many factions and communities, that remembering the pre-war world is both necessary and insufficient. Necessary because the pre-war world contains knowledge and technological capacity that the post-war world needs. Insufficient because remembering the pre-war world, without also remembering what was wrong with it, is a recipe for reproducing its failures under new management. The best communities in the franchise are the ones that can hold both things simultaneously, that can access the pre-war world's genuine achievements without being captured by its self-image. The Rivet City scientist community, the followers of the apocalypse, the railroad, all of these are communities that engage with pre-war knowledge and institutions, critically, selectively, with the ability to say both yes, this is worth keeping, and also no, this is what we are trying to not reproduce. They are communities, in other words, with functional historical consciousness, the ability to know their history well enough to use it without being determined by it. That kind of consciousness is rare in the Fallout world and rare in the real one. It is also the only kind of consciousness that makes the future genuinely open, rather than a repetition of the past under different conditions. The wasteland remembers everything. The question is which communities have learned to read what they remember clearly enough to choose differently. Supplemental: the ghouls' time made flesh. Of all the beings that the post-war world has produced, the ghouls are perhaps the most philosophically significant and the most consistently underexplored. They are everywhere in the franchise, populating the ruins, running settlements, serving as companions, appearing in every context from hostile threat to beloved friend, and yet their existence raises questions that the games circle without ever quite landing on. A ghoul is a human being who has been exposed to sufficient levels of radiation to be transformed rather than killed by it. The transformation is profound. The skin desiccates and hardens, the physical appearance becomes dramatically altered, the voice changes, the body's relationship to radiation inverts rather than being damaged by further exposure. Ghouls are sustained by it, in some cases healed by radiation that would kill an unmodified human. Their lifespan is extended dramatically. Some of the ghouls the player encounters in the games are people who were alive before the Great War, who have been living in the post-war world for 200 years or longer, who remember the pre-war world from their own experience rather than from inherited tradition. This makes them the most direct link in the franchise between the pre-war world and the present, and the games use this most effectively when they treat specific ghouls as characters whose history genuinely spans the war's divide. Roy Phillips in Fallout 3, who was alive before the bombs and whose bitterness about the discrimination ghouls face is grounded in a pre-war sense of what humans were supposed to be capable of. Raul Tejada in New Vegas, whose centuries of life have given him a historical perspective that no other companion can match. He has outlived empires, watched civilizations rise and fall in the time since the bombs, and has arrived at a kind of weary clarity about the cyclical nature of the history he has been living through. Dean Domino in New Vegas's Dead Money, a pre-war performer preserved by his ghoulification, whose grudge against the Sierra Madre's owner stretches back over 2 centuries and has become so fundamental to his identity that he cannot imagine an existence not organized around it. These ghouls carry their histories in their bodies and faces that show the physical mark of what the radiation did to them, in the specific texture of their voices, in the physical habits and cultural references of people whose formation was in a world that no longer exists. They are, in the most literal sense, survivors of the event that the franchise's entire world is organized around. They remember what the pre-war world felt like from inside. They remember what it was like before the bombs fell, not as transmitted cultural memory, not as reconstructed history, but as personal experience. They were there. The discrimination ghouls face in the post-war world is one of the franchise's most direct engagements with how the survivors of catastrophe treat each other. Ghouls, whose ghoulification is the result of the same event that devastated everyone in the post-war world, are subjected to exclusion, violence, and dehumanization by communities of humans who have classified them as less than fully human based on their physical appearance. The irony that the beings most directly harmed by the Great War are then further harmed by discrimination from communities who are themselves victims of the same event is not subtle. The franchise does not make it subtle. It puts the discrimination in front of you and asks you to decide what to do about it, through the specific choices available in specific situations. The feral ghouls who have lost their cognitive function through some combination of extreme radiation exposure and unknown biological factors complicate the ethical picture further. They are human beings who have been transformed into beings that cannot exercise the cognitive capacities that we associate with personhood. They are dangerous. They are also, in some meaningful sense, people or were people, or are in the process of being people in bodies whose cognitive architecture has been compromised. The franchise never fully engages with the question of what feral ghouls actually are at the level of consciousness, because fully engaging with it would produce a moral crisis that the gameplay of killing feral ghouls cannot survive. But the question hovers at the edge of every encounter with them. The Vault Dweller companion Hancock, the ghoul mayor of Goodneighbor in Fallout 4, is one of the franchise's most complete portraits of a ghoul as a full character. He is a politician, a philosopher of sorts, an ex-jet addict, and a person who chose to undergo voluntary ghoulification as an act of solidarity with the community he wanted to lead. He has thought carefully about what he is and what it means, and he has arrived at a position of comfortable acceptance, not indifference to the discrimination he faces, but a refusal to be diminished by it. His political philosophy, insofar as he articulates one, is that freedom means freedom for everyone, including the beings that the powerful communities of the Commonwealth would rather exclude. He is also, like most people who have been living with difficulty for a long time, someone whose equanimity covers a more complex emotional reality. The game gives him enough depth to see that the acceptance he projects is genuine and also partial, that there are things he minds about his situation that he has learned, for practical reasons, not to mind about too loudly. The ghouls as a category are Fallout's most sustained engagement, with the question of what the Great War's survivors owe each other and what it means to be a survivor at all. 200 years later, most of the people in the wasteland are survivors of the war in only the most attenuated sense. They are the descendants of survivors, shaped by a catastrophe they did not experience. The ghouls who were actually there, who watched the bombs fall, who survived the immediate aftermath, who have been living in the post-war world through its entire history, are not honored for this in most of the communities they encounter. They are excluded. Their direct experience of the event that defined everything is not valued. Their history, which is the most direct history available, is not sought. That exclusion, and the specific bitterness it produces in ghouls who remember what the pre-war world said it valued, and can compare it directly to what the post-war world actually practices, is one of the franchise's most consistent threads. The people who can most directly tell you what went wrong are the people the wasteland would rather not look at. Supplemental, the lone wanderer on being the protagonist of history. There is something that every player character in every Fallout game shares, across all their differences of name and origin and political alignment. They are alone. Not necessarily literally, companions can be recruited, settlements can be built, factions can be joined. But existentially, structurally, in the way the games present the experience of being the player character, alone. The sole survivor woke from a cryopod with a murdered spouse and a stolen son. The lone wanderer walked out of a vault that had been their entire world into a wastes that had no place for them. The courier was shot in the head and left for dead in a shallow grave. The Vault Dweller was selected and sent out and expected to accomplish something that their community could not. The aloneness is not incidental to the experience. It is structural. It is the thing that makes the player character legible as a protagonist in the environment the games create. The Wasteland is a world organized around collective survival, around community and faction and alliance, and the player character exists outside all of these in a way that makes navigation of all of them possible. They are free to move between factions, to assess them from outside, to make choices that a person embedded in any one of them could not make. The aloneness is the condition of the franchise's specific kind of moral freedom, but it is also, the games suggest, a wound. The player characters of Fallout are not unaffected by what they have lost. The sole survivor has lost a family and a world simultaneously. The lone wanderer has lost a father to a mission that kills him. The courier was not simply mugged, they were targeted, betrayed, left for dead by someone who knew them well enough to know where they would be. These losses are not background. They are the emotional fuel of the journeys the games trace. The franchise's insistence on giving its player characters genuine histories, specific backstories, specific relationships, specific losses rather than treating them as blank slates is one of its most important structural choices. A blank slate protagonist can be inserted into the wasteland without friction, can move through it without resistance, can make choices without weight. A protagonist with a history has to move through the wasteland. With the weight of that history has to make choices that are choices for a specific person, not just choices in the abstract. The Fallout player characters are not the last hope of humanity. They are not messianic figures sent to save the world. They are people who have been put in a position where the choices they make will matter, where the specific history of this specific person will intersect with the history of the region in ways that neither the person nor the region fully controls. The freedom the franchise gives the player to define what those intersections produce is not the freedom of omnipotence. It is the more limited and more interesting freedom of being a particular person in a particular situation, making the choices that person would make, and living with what those choices produce. That is the deepest level of what the Fallout games are asking you to do. Not to save the world, not to be a hero in the conventional sense, but to be a person. To bring your history and your values and your capacity for both insight and error into contact with the history and values and errors of the world around you, and to see what happens when those things meet. The world of Fallout is the world that happens when people fail at this, when institutions stop being able to see the people inside them as people, when power accumulates without accountability, when the distance between the decision and its consequence grows so large that the decision makers stop experiencing the consequence. The player character's journey is the experience of being a person who has to navigate the consequences of all those failures, who has to make choices in the rubble, who has to decide again and again, in small ways and large, what it means to be human in a world that burned because too many institutions forgot. The answer the games converge on, across all their variation and all their moral ambiguity, is the same answer it has always been. It means showing up. It means doing the thing that is in front of you to do. It means seeing the specific person in the specific situation rather than the category or the data point or the political calculation. It means being, in the wasteland, a person, which is to say, a being that can be lost and found and lost again, that can fail and learn and fail differently, that can be hurt by what happens and go on anyway. The wasteland is dark, and it is cold, and it is full of things that want to kill you. There is music on the radio. Somewhere, the mysterious stranger is waiting in the dark to help you when you need it most, for reasons you will never fully understand. The glow from the horizon is the remnant of something that burned. The ruins around you are a record of what was and what could have been and what was not. You are here. You are still here. That, in the world Fallout has built, is everything. Supplemental. The technology of ruin, what the machines know. 210 years after the Great War, there is a robot walking the perimeter of a military installation in the Mojave Desert. It has been walking this perimeter every day for 210 years. It does not know that the war it was deployed to fight is over. It does not know that the organization that deployed it has ceased to exist. It does not know that the terrain it is patrolling has changed, that what was once a military base is now a ruin, that the people it is protecting the installation from are not enemies but scavengers, not threats to national security but survivors trying to find clean water or working technology or the materials to build something livable. It walks the perimeter because it was programmed to walk the perimeter, and nothing in its programming accounts for the possibility that the perimeter is no longer worth walking. The war is over because the war destroyed everything. The robot does not have a category for this. The robot has a category for enemy combatants, and a category for friendly personnel, and a category for unauthorized presence, and everything it encounters that does not fit the second category gets sorted into the third. The killing is not malicious. The killing is procedural. The robot is doing exactly what it was told to do, in a world where the context that made those instructions meaningful no longer exists. The technology of the pre-war world, its robots, its automated systems, Its self-maintaining security infrastructure is one of the franchise's most consistent sources of horror, and the horror is specifically procedural. It is not the horror of malice. It is the horror of function, of systems continuing to execute their programming long after the conditions that justified that programming have ceased to exist, in a world that has changed beyond anything the programming anticipated, with no mechanism for updating the instructions to account for the change. The RoboBrains, the SentryBots, the Mr. Gutsy units with their mid-century military enthusiasm, the Protectrons still managing shops whose merchandise has been looted for a century, all of these are machines doing what they were built to do in a world that their specifications did not include. Their persistence is not loyalty, though it sometimes reads as loyalty. It is the absence of any instruction to stop. They were not told that the world changed. They were not told what to do if the world changed. So they continue, faithfully executing programs that have been irrelevant for 2 centuries, occasionally killing people for being in locations that their programming classifies as restricted, occasionally managing inventory for merchandise that no longer exists. The specific horror of the RoboBrains deserves particular attention. They were created using human brains extracted from living or recently deceased subjects, integrated into robotic control systems, the organic neural tissue providing cognitive capabilities that the purely mechanical systems of the era could not replicate. The brains were lobotomized to suppress higher cognitive functions that might interfere with obedience. They were, in the clinical language of the program that created them, optimized for operational use. What the optimization actually produced, and what the franchise documents in its RoboBrain encounters, is a being that has the cognitive architecture to process complex situations and make contextual judgments, paired with the behavioral constraints of a machine that cannot refuse its programming. Whether the lobotomized brain experiences anything, whether there is something that it is like to be a robo-brain, some vestige of consciousness running the perimeter checks and the weapons targeting, is a question the franchise raises in the same way it raises the question about synths. Obliquely, without resolution, through the accumulated evidence of the thing's behavior and the documented origin of what is running it. The machines of the pre-war world were built to last. The organizations that built them were not. The machines are still operating in a world their builders did not survive to maintain or correct or update. The gap between the machine's programming and the world the machine is now operating in is the gap of 2 centuries of unimaginable change, applied to systems that were designed for a specific world and have no mechanism for adapting to its absence. The Liberty Prime robot, which features in both Fallout 3 and Fallout 4, is the most dramatic version of this dynamic. A pre-war military prototype of enormous scale, a walking weapons platform over 50 feet tall, equipped with a directed energy weapon and nuclear warhead delivery systems, programmed with a Cold War ideology so thoroughly integrated into its basic operations that it delivers anti-communist proclamations while destroying obstacles. Liberty Prime was built to fight a specific war against a specific enemy using a specific ideological framework. The war is over. The enemy has been destroyed by the same apocalypse that destroyed everyone else. The ideological framework is the artifact of a political moment 200 years past. Liberty Prime, when reactivated, still fights its war, still delivers its proclamations, still approaches every obstacle through the framework of a conflict that ended before most of the people it is fighting alongside were born. The Brotherhood of Steel, which reactivates it in Fallout 3, seems not to notice or not to care about the anachronism, perhaps because the Brotherhood's own ideological framework has its own 200-year-old quality. 2 archaic institutions deploying an archaic machine against obstacles that have their own complex histories, none of which the machine's programming can process. The question the machine technology of Fallout raises most persistently is the question of what it means for a system to be outdated, not broken, not malfunctioning by its own internal standards, but simply no longer applicable to the world it is operating in. The Sentry bot is not malfunctioning when it shoots at a wastelander trying to scavenge the installation it is guarding. It is executing its programming correctly. The malfunction is not internal to the machine. It is the gap between the machine and the world, the absence of any mechanism for the machine to know that the world has changed past the point where its programming is meaningful. Human institutions have the same problem, and the franchise documents it in the same terms. The Enclave is not malfunctioning when it pursues its genocide agenda. It is executing the planning that its founders developed for exactly the circumstances that have now arrived. The Brotherhood is not malfunctioning when it confiscates technology from wastelanders who have every practical claim to that technology. It is following its institutional programming, developed for a context that has evolved past the point where the programming is applicable. The difference between these institutions and the SentryBot is that the institutions are staffed by people who, in theory, have the capacity to notice that the world has changed and update their behavior accordingly. In practice, the franchise documents, this capacity is frequently overridden by the institutional programming itself, by the accumulated weight of ideology and identity and sunk cost, and the social pressure of belonging to an organization with strong norms about what its members believe and do. People inside institutions can know that the world has changed. They frequently cannot act on that knowledge, because acting on it would require acting against the institution, and the institution is what they have. The machines walk their perimeters. The institutions follow their programming. The world changes around them, incrementally and then suddenly, in ways that their specifications did not anticipate. This is the technological horror of Fallout, and the political horror of Fallout, and, the franchise quietly insists, the human horror of Fallout. The horror of systems that continue because nothing has told them to stop, executing purposes that the present world can no longer justify, in a landscape that has moved past the conditions that made those purposes meaningful. The SentryBot will still be walking its perimeter in another 200 years if its power cell holds. It will still be executing its programming with complete fidelity. It will still be a machine doing exactly what it was built to do. Whether that constitutes function or malfunction depends on what you think the machine was ultimately built for, which is a question not about the machine but about the people who built it, and what they thought they were making, and whether they were right. A final note on sitting with darkness. The Fallout games are, at their core, an extended meditation on catastrophe, on what catastrophe looks like from inside, on what it makes of the people who survive it, on what it means to try to build something in the ruins of something else. They are dark games in a specific and considered way. Not gratuitously dark, not dark for shock value, but dark with the darkness of genuine historical consciousness. The darkness is the acknowledgement that the catastrophe happened, that it had causes, that those causes are not fully alien to the world we live in, and that the people who lived through it were people complicated, partial, capable of both tremendous harm and tremendous courage, trying to make sense of a world that had stopped making the sense they had counted on. Spending time in that darkness, following these stories, is not a nihilistic act, it is an act of witness. The Fallout universe is full of people who were lost and who found ways to continue not triumphantly, not cleanly, but with the stubborn persistence that is what survival usually actually looks like. The ghouls who have been carrying their pre-war memories for 2 centuries. The vault communities that emerged into the light and had to build identities that could survive outside the only world they had known. The factions with their imperfect ideologies and their genuine aspirations and their specific failures, and their capacity, in some cases, to learn from those failures. The quiet that settles in when you put down a controller after hours in the wasteland is not the quiet of despair. It is the quiet of having been somewhere that required your full attention, somewhere that made you feel the weight of history, and the complexity of moral choice, and the strange beauty of a world that keeps going even after it has been catastrophically broken. The bombs fell on a Saturday morning. 200 years later, people are still building, still fighting, still searching for meaning in the ruins. The ruins are full of stories. The stories are full of people. The people are doing what people have always done, which is the most remarkable thing of all. Sleep well. The wasteland will be there when you wake up. Supplemental. The great cons, the followers, and the people history forgot. History is written by the victors, the saying goes, and Fallout knows this better than most franchises do. The lore the games give you most thoroughly is the lore of the major factions, the Brotherhood, the Enclave, the Institute, the NCR, Caesar's Legion. These are the organizations with the resources to maintain records, the manpower to enforce narratives, the institutional weight to make their version of events the version that survives. But the games also carry traces of the people and communities that history would not have recorded, the ones who did not have historians, who did not have public relations programs, who were simply trying to survive in the space between the major powers and their competing claims. The great cons are perhaps the most fully realized example of this. A raider gang in the Fallout universe whose name references the Mongol Empire, and who, unlike most raider groups, have a history complex enough to constitute a genuine cultural lineage. They have been massacred twice by the NCR, once at Bitter Springs, which is documented in New Vegas with enough detail that you can understand precisely what happened and why, and once before that, in the Mojave years earlier. Each massacre reduced them to a remnant. Each remnant rebuilt. The cons that the player encounters in New Vegas are the survivors of a history that has taken everything from them multiple times and who have managed, through that history, to maintain a cultural identity and a community. The Bitter Springs Massacre is narrated in the game not through cinematic presentation but through environmental storytelling and conversation through the dry creek bed where it happened, through the veterans who survived it, through the NCR soldiers who are still trying to reconcile what they did with what they were supposed to be doing. The NCR's official account of the event and the cons account and the accounts of specific individuals present for it do not align. The gap between those accounts is the gap between institutional narrative and lived experience that characterizes how catastrophes get remembered by the powerful and the powerless. The cons who survive into the events of New Vegas have a future that is one of the game's most open possibilities. They can be helped towards something like self-determination, pointed toward a future that is not organized around rating, that is not defined entirely by their history of loss, that gives the community they have maintained through everything a chance at something more stable. Or they can remain as they are, or be destroyed, or be absorbed into one of the larger factions' plans for the region. What the game offers in the con questline is a moment of genuine possibility. A small community, historically disregarded and repeatedly victimized, having a chance at a different future. Whether that chance is taken depends on choices the player makes, but the game presents the possibility with a seriousness that the cons' history in the franchise generally has not given them. The followers of the Apocalypse appear across multiple games as a faction whose specific quality is that they do not pursue power in any of the forms that the other major factions pursue it. They pursue knowledge, specifically the applied knowledge of medicine and education and the historical record. They treat sick people, they teach, they try to preserve documents and books and the accumulated learning of the pre-war world so that it can be transmitted rather than lost. They have no territory, no military force worth speaking of, no political agenda beyond the maintenance of these specific practices. What they represent in the franchise's political landscape is the possibility that civilization is built not primarily by the faction with the most guns or the best ideology or the most visionary leader, but by the slow and unglamorous accumulation of shared knowledge and the basic practice of caring for each other's physical needs. Doctors and teachers are not the protagonists of power struggles. They are rarely the protagonists of anything. They are the people who, in the world the followers are trying to build, are doing the work that makes any other kind of building possible. The irony is that the followers, whose work is foundational, are consistently in a position of institutional vulnerability relative to the factions whose work is more immediately powerful. The NCR contains followers who advise on medical and humanitarian practice, but the NCR's political priorities frequently override the followers' recommendations. In communities throughout the wasteland, the followers' presence depends on the tolerance of whatever power structure is operating locally. Their work is essential and their institutional position is precarious, because the institutional rewards of the post-war world flow toward force and not toward healing. This is not unique to the Fallout universe. It is the persistent structural problem of every civilization that has organized its institutions primarily around competition for power rather than around the maintenance of the conditions that make life good. The institutions that get the most resources are the ones that control other institutions through force. The institutions that do the work of making human life functional medicine, education, the transmission of knowledge are perpetually underfunded relative to their importance, because their importance is diffuse and their power is not the kind that generates institutional momentum. The followers' presence in the franchise is the franchise's quiet acknowledgement of this structural problem and its equally quiet argument that the problem matters that a world organized around competition for power at the expense of the institutions that maintain life and knowledge is a world building toward its own next catastrophe, however gradually and however inadvertently. This is the final lesson the Fallout universe offers, assembled across the dozens of hours of engagement that a thorough playthrough of any game provides. Not the lesson about the bombs, or the factions, or the specific politics of any specific region in any specific game, the lesson about what civilization actually is and what it actually requires. Civilization is not a political structure. It is not a faction or a government or a power arrangement. It is the set of practices that make human life good, that allow people to eat and heal and learn and form relationships and develop the faculties that make a human life recognizably human. The political structures serve civilization when they enable these practices, and they destroy civilization when they suppress them. And the history of the pre-war world in Fallout is the history of political and corporate structures that systematically suppress the practices of civilization in the service of their own interests, while using the language of civilization to justify the suppression. The post-war world is trying to build the practices back. It is doing so in ruins, with inadequate resources, under constant threat, with the memories of the people who destroyed the first civilization still embedded in the institutions that the surviving people have built. Whether it succeeds, whether any of the communities and factions and wanderers trying to make something livable in the wasteland will manage to build something that does not simply reproduce the patterns that destroyed the old world, is the question the franchise has always been asking. It does not have a clean answer. The franchise is too honest for a clean answer. But it has a direction toward the people who are healing and teaching and preserving and sharing, toward the communities that are trying to see each other clearly rather than through the convenient lenses of faction and ideology, toward the individuals who have chosen, in the specific circumstances of their specific lives, to do the thing that is in front of them to do. That direction is not triumphant. It is not guaranteed. It is just what is available, in the ruins of the world, to the people who want something better than what the world was. The Nuka-Cola machine glows in the dark. Somewhere in the wasteland, someone is walking toward it with a bottle cap and a kind of hope that history has not yet managed to extinguish. The machine hums. The music plays on the radio. The night is long and the stars, in the cleared atmosphere of the post-war world, are extraordinary. Tomorrow, something will happen. Something always happens, and someone will be there to see it. That is enough.